hearing for those who wish to make comments to us. At the outset, I want to remind everyone present of the ground rules of the briefing. This meeting is open to the general public and to the media. In addition, we have a court reporter who is recording these proceedings. I'd like to remind my fellow members to identify yourselves before you speak. In order to accommodate all of our presenters, each presenter will have 15 minutes for their statements. After all the presenters on a specific panel have made their opening statements, I will recognize each of the advisory committee members to ask questions, and I will ask questions as well. This morning, we have 3 panels. We will have to interrupt one of the panels because we will be Skyping in Senator Jackson at 10:30. So hopefully we can stay on schedule. The open session will be held again at the end of the day today. We understand that the viewpoints presented today are neither exhaustive nor all-inclusive. Though some of the statements made today may be controversial, we want to make sure that no person or organization is defamed or degraded in this process. We expect that all opinions will be welcomed and the presenters treated with dignity and respect. Anyone present who feels defamed or degraded by statements made should inform our commission staff so there's an opportunity for public response. Alternatively, such persons or organizations may file written statements for inclusion in the proceedings. The designated federal officer, David Barreras, has the authority to end these proceedings if, in his opinion, it's in the public's best interest to do so. We are grateful to our presenters for their willingness to share their views and expertise with our committee. On behalf of the advisory committee, I thank the panelists and the members of the public for your engagement with this review. Your willingness to participate in this briefing are testament to the importance of the observance of civil rights in our society. The record of this meeting will remain open until July 13, 2019 for anyone wishing to submit a written statement. And with that, I welcome our first panel of today and begin with our first presenter, Christopher Dunn, and his colleague, Kevin Jason.
Good morning. I'm Chris Dunn. I'm the legal director of the New York Civil Liberties Union. With me is Kevin Jason, who's a staff attorney with us, who specializes in education issues. Thank you for having us, and thank you for doing this. As you may know, the New York Civil Liberties Union, the NYCLU, is the New York State affiliate of the American Civil Liberties Union. The NYCLU and the ACLU for decades have been involved with education reform work. And we bring considerable experience and some of it unhappy here in New York to this testimony. I want to emphasize at the outset that we focus primarily on intersections between education and race. And we think about funding as being very integrally related to race in the provision of educational services. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the litigation that we have done so you have an understanding of the perspective that we bring to this. And then Kevin will also talk about one of our cases, and then we have a specific proposal to present to you in terms of action we think the advisory committee can recommend. I will say at the outset, not to defame anyone, but I am disappointed that SCD and the Regents refused to come speak with you. They should have been here. There's no excuse for that. So let me just start in terms of the perspective that we bring. We are first and foremost litigators. We recognize that there are real limits to what litigation will accomplish when it comes to education and education funding. And I think that CFE, for all the wonderful things that it has done, has been an experience of hitting one's head against the wall in many respects in New York State. Nonetheless, litigation is an important vehicle for forcing the government to try to improve education and education funding. And recognizing the limits of it, we still believe and are committed to the use of the courts to improve education funding and equity in education, particularly as it relates to race. So with that said, I go back in terms of my personal experience with this issue now some 20-odd years ago when we, the NYCLU, put together a case under Title VI of the Federal Civil Rights Act, which bars the discrimination on the basis of race in the provision of educational services, amongst other services. And we put together a class action lawsuit representing students in what are dubbed in New York as high minority schools across the state, more than 90% non-white students. And that case was premised upon a very simple but dramatic factual picture, which was when you compared the high minority schools with the high white schools around New York State, it will surprise nobody to know that there were dramatic differences in the resources that were available to those schools and the students in those schools by virtue of the funding system. And there was a corresponding and predictable and caused huge disparity between the performance in those schools. And I can tell you, and I'm sure every single one of you has personally had this experience, I spent 6 months visiting high minority schools and low minority schools. And I'm not talking about New York City, I'm talking about outside of New York City. And you walk into these leafy white suburban schools, and it is one world. And you walk into an urban school in a Syracuse or a Rochester, and it is a different world. And that's a world that we cannot have in New York or anywhere else in this country. So we brought a case under Title VI, which was doing extremely well until the United States Supreme Court decided in a case called Alexander versus Sandoval that the federal regulations that we were bringing the lawsuit under could not be enforced through a private lawsuit. And the key distinction there is the difference between intentional racial discrimination and what's referred to as disparate impact. Our case was based not upon an intentional claim, which is almost impossible to prove, but upon a disparate impact claim, which is a type of claim that had been recognized for decades. When the Supreme Court decided Alexander versus Sandoval, that was the end of our case. And since then, we, the civil rights community, have been struggling, trying to figure out ways in which to use federal law to try to introduce equity in education through the funding system. So that is a major starting point for us. We then, of course, have had the CFE litigation here in New York. We, the NYCLU, brought a separate case on behalf of schools around the state, NYCLU versus State of New York, which again was intended to complement CFE, which of course is based upon New York City schools. The New York Court of Appeals shot that down. And so we are left with a landscape now in which we have CFE, we have the second case that you mentioned concerning the Syracuse schools and some New York City schools. And there's a third case that Kevin is going to talk about, and then once he's talked about that, I will come back and talk about the proposal that we have for you.
Hi, good morning. That additional case is Maysville versus State of New York. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that. It's sometimes known as the small cities case. It was it's still pending, and it was filed in 2008 by families of students in small city school districts like Niagara, Mount Vernon, Poughkeepsie, and Kingston. And they were alleging that they were receiving an insufficient education based off of inadequate funding, and that they weren't able to receive a sound basic education, the standard under CFE. Each of these districts had the following characteristics also. They were all low property wealth, all had high student need, and they all had significant family poverty within them. When the case was brought to trial, it was a 10-week trial. It was a voluminous record that was created. However, the trial judge summarily dismissed the matter in a decision that was 16 pages, double-spaced. She didn't really engage with the issues. The NYCLU filed an amicus brief when it was from the third department. There we brought up that the court also applied an incorrect standard, one that deviated from CFE and would have created an extremely difficult, if not impossible, path forward for people to bring school funding cases going forward. Also, we raised the point that the judge didn't really engage with the facts with these particular districts. Luckily, the third department agreed, and they ordered the trial court to revisit the matter and to do an analysis for each of these districts. Under CFE, plaintiffs are required to show that there is insufficient inputs or resources that are causally related to poor outcomes or outputs. Even though the trial judge in this decision that was finally issued in January of 2019, earlier this year, even though she found that there was poor outcomes and the output measure was essentially found, she didn't do a real engagement with the inputs. She didn't really meaningfully try to analyze how these schools and students would have benefited from having more resources from the state. For example, when it came to matters regarding supplemental services for poverty and English as a second language, she said that it's not the core mission of the educational system to repair those outside social concerns and problems, and she referred to social workers as aspirational service. I think many here would disagree with those findings. And now that matter is being presented in the third department again, where the plaintiffs have appealed once more. Now, Chris had also talked about the intersection of education and race, but I think it's also important to talk about the intersection of school funding and segregation. In New York State, there are over 700 school districts, all of which have geographical boundaries that are largely influenced by racially discriminatory policies and practices. In 2014, New York State was identified and singled out as the most segregated state in the country. Unfortunately, disparities also exist between funding disparities also correlate with racial disparities, and non-white districts receive on average $2,000 less dollars per pupil than white districts in New York State. And any solutions to this issue of segregation, any that would be ambitious, would have to take into account some interdistrict policies, like recreating boundaries or merging districts. The disparities in funding are going to present a sizable issue with that, and we ask that the committee and the commission also look at this issue from the lens of segregation as well, to not maintain this inexcusable status quo.
Okay, so in terms of, I mean, you know, the committee is going to have, of course, a wide range of opportunity to make recommendations or suggestions. And as Kevin's suggesting, you know, one thing that we think is very important is recognizing in your thinking and what you produce, for instance, a connection between segregation and funding. And that, of course, is part of a point that was made right at the outset, that education funding deeply implicates race, and the biggest scandal in our educational system is the racial discrimination that is central to it. From a litigation perspective, you know, what's important for us in terms of something that you could do, and it goes back to this issue about what the Supreme Court did in undercutting the ability of civil rights advocates like the ACLU to use litigation to try to improve education and education funding, is to restore what was taken away in Alexander versus Sandoval, namely the right to bring a lawsuit based upon not just intentional discrimination, but the disparate impact of education schemes on race. And I recognize that you are not Congress, but you are in a position to make recommendations that ultimately can translate into legislation. And the fix here, and there is a simple fix, and I don't mean it's politically simple, but it is logistically simple, is to do what the Supreme Court said Congress had not done in Title VI, which is to make clear that disparate impact theory is something that advocates can use to bring lawsuits and force change when it comes to education funding and education discrimination. That is recognized in a variety of other statutes. It exists in other places, particularly the Fair Housing Act, which is Section 8 of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And we would specifically recommend that this body push a proposal, as has been made in some quarters, that Title VI be amended to allow for a private cause of action on a disparate impact theory. Beyond that, I don't, as I sit here, have a sense of your ability to make recommendations in New York itself. But we, the ACLU, have, in the aftermath of Alexander versus Sandoval, gotten other jurisdictions to adopt Title VI disparate impact statutes so that advocates in those states can bring lawsuits in the state, against the state, on a disparate impact theory. Illinois has done that. We have a couple of states that have done that. And to the extent that this body has the ability to do so, we would ask them to make a recommendation to the New York State Legislature adopt a disparate impact theory that would allow advocates like us to not only bring these adequacy cases, which are valuable but complicated, but also to be able to bring a race-based disparate impact case against the state of New York. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chris. Kevin, we'll be back after we finish with the panel. Thank you. Jim Malatras?
Good morning. It's a little bit of a better morning, a little rainy, but my name is Jim Malatras, and I'm the president of the Rockefeller Institute of Government, the State University of New York's Public Policy Research Institute. I have also served as executive director to the state's new New York Education Reform Commission and as a senior official to Governor Andrew Cuomo. It is a pleasure to be with you this morning to discuss an important issue of paramount concern, ensuring every student has a quality education. As New York Governor and President Lincoln's eventual Secretary of State, William H. Seward, said in 1839, the standard of education ought to be elevated. Education is the chief of our responsibilities. Given the broad cross-section of expert testimony before you, for my brief remarks, I want to reframe the premise of the discussion a bit. Are there funding inequities in New York State? The answer is yes. But are New York State funding formulae driving the inequality? The answer is no. New York schools are funded by three principal sources: local funding, primarily property taxes, federal aid, and state aid. Wealthier communities invest considerably more into their local school districts than our lower wealth communities. That is why per pupil spending in New York ranges from approximately $13,000 per student to nearly $40,000 per student. This is where the state steps in. State education funding acts in large part as an equalizer. First, New York spends more per student on education than any other state in the nation, more than twice the national average. New York invested more than $28 billion into education in this year's state budget alone, and that does not include the local or federal share. To put that in perspective, New York spends more just on education than the entire budgets of Rhode Island, Delaware, Vermont, and Maine combined. Not only does New York spend the most on education, the system itself is progressive. Analyzing State Department of Education data, nearly 70% of all state education aid goes to the state's neediest schools, while the wealthiest schools get only a fraction of state aid, around 14%. As a result, New York's progressive system allows for needier schools to spend significantly more, though it may not be equal to the state's wealthiest schools. While state funding cannot bring parity among all school districts, the fact is that because of state's education funding, every single school district in New York State, the nearly 700 districts, spend more per pupil than the national average. And I've included a couple of tables for the written testimony for your consideration. Put it another way, if New York's neediest schools were a state, they would have the second highest per pupil spending in the nation, second only to New York's other districts. Let me give you an example for context. Take two school districts in New York: Bedford, a wealthy school in suburban county of Westchester, and the Buffalo City School District in Erie County, a low-wealth urban school district that was mentioned a bit here this morning. The Bedford School District receives only 5.8% of its total revenue from New York State, while Buffalo gets more than 70% of its total revenue from the state. In Bedford, nearly 88% of their funding comes from local revenue versus only 15.5% in Buffalo. The fact is that Bedford spends more per pupil than Buffalo, $29,000 per student versus $22,000 per student. But let's put that into perspective as well. Without the state's aid, Buffalo's per pupil spending would be significantly less, and at $22,766 per pupil, the Buffalo City School District spends 18% more per student than the second highest spending state in the nation, Connecticut, which spends $19,000 per student. That said, the distribution of state aid is not perfect. As occurs with many other issues society must grapple with, politics and regional differences play a role in how state education aid is distributed. Therein lies one of the issues driving potential inequities and one of the main weaknesses under the initial creation of the foundation aid formula, the formula which is the specific focus of your inquiry today. Foundation aid was in part created by former Governor Eliot Spitzer to respond to the State Courts of Appeals decision in the Campaign for Fiscal Equity decision that required additional aid be spent in New York City to meet a sound-based education. However, it went well beyond the Campaign for Fiscal Equity decision. In essence, it gave every school district significantly more aid in order to make a new formula politically palatable. The issue with this everyone gets more approach, however, was that if there was an economic downturn, the program, because of its dramatic aid increase, would be susceptible to problems in funding the formula, which is exactly what happened. Because of the Great Recession, Governor Spitzer quickly froze his own foundation aid plan after 1 year. My basic point is that foundation aid formula did spend more on needier schools. You'll hear others testify about potential tweaks needed to maximize the progressivity of the formula. Over time, formulae need to be adjusted. For example, the Citizen Budget Commission has an interesting proposal to fix foundation aid without spending significantly more, and I'm not saying that just because Dave is sitting right behind me. It's a very good proposal. Thus, the problem isn't with the foundation aid formula itself. The formula is progressive, but with the everyone gets more approach to make it politically feasible to have it passed in the first place. Such a policy regime isn't economically sustainable, and it doesn't maximize spending in our neediest schools. And it's not just foundation aid. There are various state education spending streams that need revisiting. We can name them. There's a whole host of them. Therefore, the fundamental question is, would policy makers be open to redistributing state aid at an even greater level from our wealthier to our neediest districts? Should our state's wealthiest schools get even the small fraction of state aid they currently receive, or would we be better served sending that aid to schools that need it the most? Those are some of the questions policymakers are grappling with now. But there are other important policy issues policymakers must grapple with to fix inequities in our schools. While state education aid is distributed by the state to the districts using foundation aid and other progressive formulae, school districts have broad discretion in distributing aid to their individual schools. Because of an important new district spending transparency requirement enacted into state law last year, for the first time, the public is able to see exactly how districts spend their school aid. We at the Rockefeller Institute of Government analyzed the available data for the Big Five school districts, Buffalo, New York City, Rochester, Syracuse, and Yonkers, and found inequities in the distribution of the aid. I provided a copy of the report for the committee's consideration. We found that the districts didn't allocate funding to individual schools following the same criteria under foundation aid. For example, the Buffalo School District gave their highest poverty districts 26% less per pupil than the district's wealthiest schools. New York City gave 12% less per pupil. Rochester gave 2% less per pupil. Syracuse gave 12% less per pupil. And Yonkers gave 14% less per pupil. That is if you applied the foundation aid formula to how the districts sent it to their schools. In essence, state education aid doesn't always trickle down from the district to the individual schools in the most equitable manner. Put another way, it dilutes the intent of foundation aid from the district level to the individual school. In addition, there are other non-funding inequities that must be addressed as well, especially in our communities of color. Let me provide the committee with one example. In a recent analysis of teacher staffing in New York State, we found that districts with higher percentages of Black and Hispanic students had a greater number of teachers teaching out of their certification areas or without certification entirely, teachers who were more inexperienced, and had a higher annual turnover rates. I've also presented that copy of the report on teaching staffing in New York. This doesn't, however, correspond neatly to how much funding the districts were receiving. Something more complex is going on. But the equity gap is real and persistent and must be addressed. And I'll give one more example before I close because it was raised. Funding doesn't always neatly correspond to academic performance. And I'll give you two school districts in Westchester because one was raised. The city of Mount Vernon's average per pupil spending is $27,000 per year per student. In Port Chester, which is a neighboring community, which is largely white, is $19,000. Half of the schools within the Mount Vernon School District have the bottom 20% academic performance, not one in Port Chester. So it doesn't always neatly correspond to funding and performance. It's a more complex thing. But at the same time, the funding formula from the state is not in itself its problem. There are deeper, more problematic societal things. I don't disagree with what my colleagues are saying up at the dais with me and others who have been testifying. But it needs a broader scale approach, and I think you have to look at all of the funding formulae in the state, not just one, to try to drive some of the inequities in the issue. And I think you have to separate out the level of funding versus the way in which it's distributed among the districts. And that is a more complicated political argument to make when you live on Long Island, or if you live in New York City, or if you live in upstate New York. And a couple of the cases that the American Civil Liberties Union, New York Civil Liberties Union, and others have brought have shone a light on the upstate rural districts because there have been issues there because they are politically less powerful. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jim. Sarita?
Good morning. My name is Sarita Subramanian, and I'm the Supervising Analyst for Education Research at the New York City Independent Budget Office. IBO is a city agency providing nonpartisan policy analysis and information for elected officials and the public. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at this briefing. My testimony will focus on the student needs that are factored into the Pupil Needs Index portion of the New York State Foundation Aid formula, and how those needs are accounted for in formula used in other states. Additionally, I will compare the student needs weights considered in New York State's funding formula with how those weights are included in New York City's own weighted student funding formula, known as Fair Student Funding. Finally, I will discuss how certain components of the Foundation Aid formula could be improved and how the exclusion of a weight for students with disabilities in the Pupil Need Index could disproportionately negatively impact state funding for students of color in New York City. There are 3 key points for my testimony that I would like to highlight. First, although New York State's methodology for distributing education funding is considered to be progressive relative to other states, the systems in place in 2 other more progressive states, New Jersey and Connecticut, provide context for ways to improve New York State's formula. Specifically, funding could be better targeted to student needs if adjustments were made based on students' grade level and the degree to which additional supports are needed for English language learners and students with disabilities. Second, certain components of New York State's Foundation Aid formula are based on conditions from 2007, when the formula was first created. This includes accounting for district-level shares of school-age children in poverty, adjustments for different regional costs across the state, and the selection of weights for different student needs. Lastly, it is important to reconsider how the Foundation Aid formula accounts for students with disabilities. Currently, the needs for students with disabilities are accounted for in a separate part of the formula from the needs of students in poverty and English language learners. The last 2 factors are also adjusted for regional cost differences. In the interest of time, I will summarize the remainder of my written testimony. IBO compared New York State's formula with those used in 2 other states, New Jersey and Connecticut, which a recent Urban Institute report found to be the most progressive states among the 50. That is, they had the largest difference in per pupil state funding for districts serving high shares of poor students compared with districts serving low shares of poor students. States with a positive difference are termed progressive, those with a negative difference are termed regressive, and those with almost no difference are termed neutral. In New York State, the progressive nature of state funding, 9th most progressive in the country, does not compensate for the highly regressive nature of local funding, the 6th most aggressive in the country. New York State's tax relief program, STAR, contributes to the regressive nature of local funding as it exacerbates inequities in district wealth. Districts with lower student needs and generally greater ability to generate revenue are allocated more property tax relief on a per pupil basis. New York State ranks second to last because of the regressivity of total funding, state and local, across all 50 states. Only Illinois is considered more regressive based on the Urban Institute study. Even when also taking federal funding into account, the study ranks New York State as the 5th most regressive. Why is New York State's funding formula not more progressive? When the state's Foundation Aid formula was introduced in 2007 in response to the 2006 Court of Appeals decision in the Campaign for Fiscal Equity versus New York State, State of New York case, it was intended to address inequities in the distribution of state education aid to districts. Unfortunately, as my colleague mentioned, state aid only increased by $2.1 billion towards the planned 4-year phase-in target of $5.5 billion, partly due to the recession in 2008-2009. And the original Foundation Aid formula has never been fully phased in. Furthermore, the formula has remained unchanged since it was initially introduced over a decade ago and could benefit from a more nuanced perspective on how to account for student need. How student need is factored into state funding formulae, New Jersey, Connecticut, and New York State. All 3 states provide a base per pupil amount and use multipliers to provide funding for certain groups of students that require additional educational supports. Each multiplier is therefore greater than 1. For example, if a particular student need was given a multiplier of 1.2, it implies that it costs 20% more to provide educational supports for that student, over and above what is provided by the base per pupil amount. The 3 states incorporate multipliers for all or some of the following student characteristics: grade, English language learner status, poverty, special education, and a career and technical education. In New York State, a district's total foundation aid amount is calculated by multiplying the selected foundation aid by a district's weighted per pupil count, as the chart on page 4 of my testimony shows. Selected foundation aid is the per pupil foundation aid that a district receives based on the district's pupil need index and regional cost index after subtracting the district's expected local contribution, which accounts for district's wealth. The pupil need index incorporates weights for English language learners, students in poverty, those who are eligible for free or reduced price lunch, the district's U.S. census-based share of students in poverty, and a district's sparsity count. New Jersey and Connecticut do not account for sparsity in their formula. Among the 3 states, a unique feature of New York State's formula is the use of a regional cost index to adjust the pupil need index. The regional cost index accounts for variations in purchasing power in 9 different regions of the state and ranges from 1 to the 1.425 used for Long Island and New York City. This means the multipliers for the student need categories included in the pupil need index are adjusted based on which of the 9 regions a district is located in. The weighted pupil count first considers full day and half day enrollment. Then additional weights are incorporated for students with disabilities, students declassified from special education, and students in summer school. While needs for English language learners and students in poverty are accounted for in the pupil need index, which is in turn adjusted for differences in regional costs, the needs for students with disabilities and students declassified from special education are accounted for in the district's weighted pupil count. New York State compared with New Jersey and Connecticut. New Jersey's main per pupil formula provides the most nuanced perspective of individual student need characteristics. It is the only one of the 3 states to provide additional funding for middle and high school students. The base funding amount is for an elementary school student. New Jersey is also alone among the 3 states in including all students with disabilities and students in career and technical education in its need index. Connecticut and New York State account for those students outside of their need indices. 2 student-level categories that are incorporated into the per-pupil formula in all 3 states are for English language learners and students in poverty. Connecticut and New York State provide flat multipliers for English language learners, while New Jersey provides 1 of 2 multipliers depending on if a student is also in poverty. New York State provides a flat multiplier in all districts for students in poverty, while New Jersey and Connecticut provide higher multipliers for districts with greater shares of students in poverty. What can we learn from New York City's Fair Student Funding formula? Around the same time that New York State began implementing its foundation aid formula, New York City implemented its own version of a weighted student formula, Fair Student Funding, to distribute funds to schools based on the needs of the students they served. New York City is unique among New York State school districts in having their own weighted pupil formula. Since it was implemented in 2007-08, the formula has evolved over time, both in terms of the student needs incorporated as well as adjustments to the multipliers for each weight category. For the upcoming school year, there will be 33 different student need weights incorporated across 5 broad categories: grade level, academic intervention, English language learner needs, special education needs, and students attending portfolio high schools. When identifying the multiplier for each weight, this Fair Student Funding formula takes into account the student's grade level, as well as differences in the type of programming needed to support the students. The grade level weights operate in a similar manner to what I described in New Jersey. The base funding is for elementary school students with additional funds for middle and high school students. The weights in the 4 other broad categories provide additional funds on top of those weights. The academic intervention weights take into consideration the incoming academic achievement for students that schools serve. poverty is used as a proxy for the need for academic intervention services only in the absence of prior test scores for incoming students. Other weights within this category vary by students' grade level and the degree to which they are underperforming, below standards or well below standards, or if they have not amassed an appropriate number of course credits or exhibited other challenges necessary for graduation. For English language learners, the formula looks separately at students' grade level and also factors in the type of program students are enrolled in, whether they are enrolled in English as a new language classes or bilingual education classes. There are also multipliers for students who are declassified for 2 years after they test out. And finally, there is an additional weight for all students whose formal education has been interrupted. As with English language learners, weights for students with disabilities vary by the frequency at which they receive those services, less than 20% of the week, between 21 and 59% of the week, or greater than 60% of the week, and a distinction in the type of services they receive. Students with disabilities in integrated co-teaching classrooms that serve students with disabilities alongside their peers without disabilities and provide both a general and special education teacher receive the highest multipliers. The formula also separately considers those placed in self-contained classrooms. Self-contained classes serve only students with disabilities, have small class sizes, and may have an additional paraprofessional in the room. Finally, students in portfolio high schools receive additional support for the specialized career and technical education programs offered, or for any required special academic or arts-related instruction. There are also additional multipliers for students who transfer. The nuances in the formula used in New York City, New Jersey, and Connecticut may suggest ways to improve upon New York State's own foundation aid formula. Several components of New York State's foundation aid formula have been frozen in time, much like the formula itself. In the Pupil Need Index, the weights for different needs have remained the same since the formula was created in 2007. In addition, the U.S. census-based share of students in poverty is still based on the 2000 decennial census. IBO compared the poverty rates in 2000 with those in 2016 for New York State school districts based on census data. About 80% of the state's districts experienced an increase in the share of school-age residents in poverty, with increases ranging from 1 to 19 percentage points. For school districts that experienced an increase over those years, the average district experienced a 4.5 percentage point increase. New York City's share of students in poverty was roughly the same in 2016 as it was in 2000, about 27%, although it fluctuated during that time, reaching a high of almost 31% in 2012. Finally, the regional cost index remains at its 2006 levels. In addition to taking into account a student's grade level and the type of programs that are needed for English language learners and students with disabilities, another useful adjustment to the New York State's formula might be to include students with disabilities in the Pupil Need Index within the foundation aid formula. In New York City schools that received Fair Student funding last year, over half of students with disabilities were in integrated co-teaching classes, for which the Fair Student funding formula provides the highest multipliers among all 33 weights. Additionally, many studies have documented that students with disabilities are disproportionately Black and Hispanic. IBO's analysis of data for New York City public schools found that 78% of students with disabilities were Black or Hispanic, although they comprise 67% of the student population. Therefore, adjusting how students with disabilities are incorporated into the foundation aid formula could help address concerns about the disproportionately lower funding to districts that serve high shares of students in color. When looking across New York State's school districts, all but one of the Big Five school districts rank among the top 25 districts among almost 700 in terms of their share of students with disabilities. New York City in particular could gain an additional boost when the regional cost index is also considered. If students with disabilities were included in the Pupil Need Index, the counts for those students would additionally be adjusted for New York City's regional cost index of 1.425. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you very much, Sarita. Chris, let me just ask you a quick couple of questions. Does the Title VI approach require a federal nexus in terms of funding?
It does. Title VI applies to recipients of federal funds.
And so would that work as a matter of across-the-board New York State litigation? Because, is every state district, every district receiving federal funds?
I mean, I can't tell you as a matter of fact that every single one is. I am confident that they are. Federal funding is just such a central part of state education systems that I'm confident that's the case.
And isn't there an alternative approach in terms of bringing an action which is sort of the DOJ or the Office of Civil Rights within the state, et cetera, could still bring a Title VI action themselves?
In theory, the Department of Justice has the ability to enforce the regulations through administrative actions. I do not know of a single instance in which they have done that. They certainly have not done that in New York State. And we will go through generations of children before I suspect that will happen.
And do you think that there's within your community a view that you could overturn Rodriguez by looking at education, looking at it from the point of view of instead of poverty, racial discrimination?
I think within the civil rights community, there is very little optimism about the Supreme Court in the near future, fundamentally changing constitutional law to the benefit of students, particularly students of color.
Thank you. Jim, there are people who believe that per pupil spending in New York City is a function in part of cost of living and other factors, property values, et cetera, that push that number up. But you suggested, you were making a point that almost there's sufficient amounts of funding, maybe it's just a distribution issue.
Even if you take Connecticut or the neighbor states, New Jersey, New York still exceeds in every district. Even low wealth, high need districts still spend more than those states. That is a separate question, though, whether the money is being distributed equitably from the district. And we ran the foundation aid formula when we finally got the data to go from the district to the school level, and it just wasn't equal, right? I mean, they're being underfunded as a matter of running the own. Now, you may question the perfection of the foundation aid, and I think there's a lot to be said to fix the foundation aid, but just purely using those criteria right now, those schools, individual schools, New York City is a big district. There's thousands of schools. It's not being equitably funded. They're underfunding certain schools just on the data alone. So it is a distribution issue in many ways, not just the number. We spend a lot in New York.
And how do you think that ought to be fixed, since the foundation formula is district-based?
I think what often happens gets conflated, and I have great respect for some of the folks that you have, especially participating today. Senator Jackson has been a fierce advocate for public education. We just have a difference of opinion sometimes. There's the number, how much should be spent on education every year? What's the annual increase versus the distribution? I think what often got how New York solves the distribution problem, and this was the foundation aid concept, where even advocates were surprised at the final number in the original foundation aid, was the number just everybody got more. The way to solve the political problem is Long Island low-need districts get fundamentally a ton of more money. I think you have to balance those issues. I think ultimately the distribution issue is politically more difficult because there are winners and losers in a greater way. But often the case in any difficult public policy is if you dramatically want to fix these structural problems, you do have to have a period of time where you are adjusting, and there are some winners and losers.
So there are also those who argue that highest need districts actually need significant geometrically increased amounts vis-a-vis their counterparts in order to actually equalize education.
Year to year in New York, though, that is what happens. Higher need districts get more annual average increases than lower need districts. That is how it works out. The question always becomes, which is the difficult question. If you're in Syosset, which is a very wealthy district on Long Island, you have mostly education is a localized issue with localized funding. You can't tell Syosset, you have to equalize to everybody else. But it's also impossible to say, you may be $40,000 per student every year, but we can make everybody else $40,000 per student every year because you'll have a revolt from the taxpayers. what we try to do as the best we can, I'm not justifying that there are not problems in our schools. There are dramatic issues of parity and equity in our schools. It's how you address those issues. But on the whole, does state aid equalize to get some of our neediest districts well above the national average? Yes. Even above the second highest spending state in the nation? Yes. Is it a perfect system? I think there's a lot to be said. Should we be so resolved to say local property taxes should be the primary function of funding some education sources? I mean, folks talk about STAR, but STAR's not even direct aid to the schools. It's to the taxpayers. So often that gets conflated in the argument. $4 billion STAR program. Not a dollar of that goes to a school district. So when they say, well, wealthier districts get STAR, that district doesn't see a dime of it. So how you tease through some of those issues are very important. But I think fundamentally, I think the issue is right. The New York City and others saying, let's look at the aid formulas and let's really figure out how to redo it in a way. I think all across the board. Should we be doing reimbursable aids the way we do? Reimbursable aids favor wealthier districts that can capitalize certain projects and then get it paid back. Or should we have a broad-scale system where there's one formula that drives based on need? I think you need that fundamental look at the formula as opposed to Band-Aid it and just keep giving everybody more and expecting.
Formula.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize my colleagues to ask questions.
Alex Vitale. I wanted to ask Dr. Malatras and Ms. Subramanian, we appreciate the attempt to try to make the formula more progressive, but of course we don't really have the formula operating at the moment. We have this tier or so-called share system in place. So is that system of funding increases more or less progressive than the formula as is, much less a formula as we might want to improve it?
Well, shares is the shorthand Albany version of the three regions, upstate, New York City, and Long Island, for people who know, get the specific dollar amount regardless. So it's an interesting question. The question you ask yourself is how do you solve that problem? I think this is a political problem, not an academic problem. And for folks who say it's an easy problem to solve. Now, I can come and I think you can adjust the foundation aid formula and create a new formula that is more equitable on a piece of paper, and then everybody looks at me and says, you're a nice think tank guy, but I just got elected on Long Island, and we're in control now, and you're now telling me I have to go back to my residents, even though they're wealthier, and say, I now have to give more money to New York City and upstate. They're not going to be elected senators very long. That's the historic problem you run into. So whenever you're trying to adjust the formula, that is exactly the problem. New York City, of course, has CFE, a decision which people argue, I think the dollar amount has been paid for. This always gets conflated into how much are you spending and what is the methodology by which you're distributing it. I do think there have been added programs in the state to attempt to overcome the regional distribution, and I'll give you a couple. We did a $2 billion bond act when I was in the state. We did a community schools program. We did other things where you're driving larger sources of money to the neediest schools as a way to sort of put the traditional argument over shares and other things aside. But that always becomes that is the political question I'm talking about. I think if you went right now and said to some of the neediest, the highest wealth schools, by the way, don't get any federal aid. Not many, but there's some that get zero federal aid. They have no low-income minority students. So I think the case could still apply. It's because it's just a number. But I think if you were drawing it up, I would say if you said on average the amount of state aid the lowest needs schools, the wealthiest schools get was 5%. And that averages out sometimes to about 5% in some of our regions. And you made it 3.5%, you can draw a significant amount of money to the neediest schools. The question is, do you have the political appetite to do such a thing? At the same time of saying, also take away the local wealth, which is the property tax and other things, that you can't use that in a level anymore to bump it up. I think that becomes a very difficult question and is why you're sitting here with us today and why foundation aid as a concept
I'm going to try and, I'd given you a written copy of my testimony. I'm going to try and skip around a bit to cover points that other panelists have not made yet. Thank you very much for having me today. CBC, the Citizens Budget Commission, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank dedicated to achieving constructive change in the finances and services of New York City and New York State government. As discussed before from some other panelists, when the state first created foundation aid, there were political compromises and a reluctance to decrease aid to wealthy districts that resulted in flaws in the design of the original formula. As a result, despite significant increases in state aid and local revenues, not all districts have the resources to provide a sound basic education in school year 2020. My testimony is going to go into detail on three specific points. The flaws of the foundation aid formula, particularly the calculation or the absence of a real calculation of the local share. The increase in total education funding since the foundation aid formula was created. And third point, that there are we've been able to identify 29 school districts that will not have enough funding to provide a sound basic education in school year 2020 based on the most recent adopted budget. So kind of going into some of the flaws of the foundation aid formula, it inequitably allocates aid based on the arbitrary adjustments that have been discussed, outdated data, and inconsistent local share calculations. I think that's one area that perhaps has not gotten enough attention based on some of the prior testimony. So basically, the formula overstates the need for state aid to individual districts. In the calculation, the formula has 5 or 6, depending on how you want to count, different ways of calculating how much the local should be contributing, none of which actually account for how much the districts are contributing. This results in many very wealthy districts continuing to get considerable amounts of aid, and also less wealthy districts that are taxing themselves considerably are still getting a lot of state aid. So just the wealthiest decile of districts, the top 10% of districts, are on track to spend about $1.9 billion in the coming school year. $1.9 billion more than is necessary to fund a sound basic education pursuant to the foundation aid formulas calculations. Those districts are on track to spend more than $33,000 per student and still receive $475 million in state aid. And yet, after all of that, the calculation, the formula, if you were to read the formula and that $4 billion number that was discussed by a number of other panelists, would show that those districts are underfunded by $67 million. The calculation of how much it costs to provide a sound basic education has similar issues as well. So certainly not saying that the base calculation is flawless, but that leads to overstating of costs in some districts and understating of costs in other districts. Over time, these problems have been exacerbated by a prohibition against decreases in aid, the hold harmless that you discussed, and that it's not on a per pupil basis, that's not a district basis. So you do have some districts that have seen a decrease in enrollment of between 10, 15, even close to 20%. And at the same time, they're guaranteed to get at least the same amount of foundation aid every year. And in many years, there's an automatic increase built in. So you can have a district that has a 2% decrease in enrollment. They're guaranteed a 2% increase in foundation aid. So they're actually getting about a 4% increase in foundation aid, where you have other districts that could see a 2% increase in enrollment and a 2% increase in foundation aid. They're getting the same percentage increase in aid, but per pupil, it actually is very different. In addition to the foundation aid, there are other forms of school aid, which I know Jim Latras touched on the prior panel, and that's almost $9 billion, and many of those distribute too much aid to wealthy districts as well, particularly library, textbook, and software aids. Total about $240 million, and they take no account of district wealth, so they provide the exact same amount per pupil, regardless of whether you're the poorest district or the wealthiest district in the state. There's also high tax aid, which specifically targets $223 million annually, largely to wealthy districts. There are a handful of non-wealthy districts that get it, but every single district on Long Island gets it, and then there are a handful throughout the rest of the state, basically, that get it. Total education funding has increased significantly since foundation aid was created. There's some tables in my written testimony that highlight that. But focusing just on the change in state aid ignores the way that school districts are funded. Many local districts have increased their spending considerably based on their property tax revenue. And I think that kind of gets lost in the conversation about educational inequities and funding, that the revenue is coming from those multiple sources. So between school year 2007 and 2017, total district revenues increased by $20 billion or 40%, which is twice the rate of inflation. When you hear some of the advocates talk, you'd think that, it barely kept pace. State education aid increased 30% or $6.5 billion, whereas local revenues increased 54% or $13.3 billion, with New York City basically doubling their local contribution over that 10-year period. Increases in state aid were concentrated in the least wealthy districts, while local aid increased relatively evenly outside of New York City. Federal aid growth was much more varied, but it's a much smaller part of school district revenues. The per pupil story is a little different, again, because of the changes and the differences. New York City has growing enrollment. For the most part, outside of the city, there's a decline in enrollment. So state aid per pupil in New York City only increased 20%. It was actually pretty much in line with inflation over that 10-year period. I don't think I mentioned before, 2017 is the most recent year of actual data, which is the reason why I stopped there. Lastly, and many other, or at least a few other people mentioned this, New York does spend more than any other state in the nation on a per pupil basis. Total revenues in school year 2017 were about $24,000 per pupil, which is almost twice as much as the national average. It's anywhere between about 15% higher than the second, the highest state in the nation. And just to put it in perspective, so for a school for a classroom with 20 kids in it, it's almost $500,000 for that one classroom. And I'd encourage you to refer to the tables. On our website, we also have a map where you can actually look at each individual school district, which is kind of fun to play with. And we also have a map of those school districts that we have identified as not having enough funding to provide a sound basic education. So to kind of go into how we did that, so school districts are on track to spend about $73 billion in school year 2020. Based on our analysis and using the foundation aid formula, which calculates how much it should cost to provide a sound basic education in every school district, that would be about $73 billion, which is $13 billion more than how much it would cost for a sound basic education. I summarized my methodology in Appendix B, but essentially we took the foundation aid formula, how much it costs to provide a sound basic education for every student, multiplied by that, by the number of students with the appropriate weighting for students with disabilities, and then we added on costs that are outside the foundation aid formula from the actuals from 2017, trended things forward, and from that, we found 29 school districts will lack those resources. And of those 29 districts, the total cost is only about $83 million to bring it up. With half of that 83 million, about 40 million, in Brentwood, the school district on Long Island that was actually, I think it was in the last panel, I apologize, which is a majority minority school district. I think it's 97% non-white. So many districts are receiving much more state aid than is needed per that calculation of when you look at what it actually costs to provide a sound basic education. There are 165 of the 674 school districts raise enough money just from local revenues to provide a sound basic education, and yet we'll still receive almost $2 billion in state aid. That's state aid that could go to other schools. And to kind of circle back to something I mentioned before, the calculation of sound basic education is part of the school aid formula. It was a political calculation to a certain extent, and it's certainly not flawless. It uses some data from the year 2000. It groups in, for the regional cost index, Long Island and New York City, which is probably not an accurate reflection of the actual labor costs. But it does mean that $4 billion figure of what is owed is just not accurate when you dig further into the formula. So we believe that if you were to, and Jim Latris had referenced the report we did previously, where if you were to change the foundation aid formula, update the data, get rid of the hold harmlesses, you could really fund and increase funding to those high need districts. And then I'd like to offer one more point that kind of gets to something the senator said about being able to find the money. The state and the nation are in the midst of the longest economic expansion in basically in recorded history. Only goes back to the mid-1800s, but still. So the potential of an economic recession will have a significant impact, or an actual economic recession will obviously have an impact on states' finances. The last time there was a significant recession, the state adopted a surcharge on millionaires, which raises about $5 billion a year, but has kept that in place. So the state doesn't have that to fall back on. And at the same time, the state's reserves are only about $3 billion, which would cover about 10% of how much you'd expect to lose in revenues over that following 3-year period. So we believe that if the state were to change the foundation aid formula and the other education formulas as well, it could save some money, put that into reserves so that when the next recession does come, you won't see education aid need to be cut. And that's what happened the last time. In 2009, there was the gap elimination adjustment, which, actually decreased aid from year to year. And I think anybody who's planning a budget, school districts or otherwise, at least having consistency and not having decreases in year-to-year aid is particularly important. That concludes my testimony. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll come back for questioning at the end of the panel. Dr. Bloomfield?
Yeah, not a doctor,
You're not?
just a lawyer.
Forgive me.
Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee on the urgent need to reform New York's system of financing education in order to promote the civil rights of all students. The right to a sound basic education is enshrined in our Constitution and pegged at the level of a meaningful high school education by the New York State Court of Appeals in CFE 2. But we see from the ensuing years since CFE 2 and in the Court of Appeals' subsequent decision in CFE 3 that judicial decrees are of little use in Albany's political hotbed of competing school district interests vying for self-limited funds. As a result, state and local funding disparities between our wealthiest districts and poorest districts are systemic, with the State Education Department estimating the gap at approximately $10,000 per pupil, despite the greater need in poor districts to meet even the sound basic education threshold. Flowing from this inequity are pervasive proficiency challenges among students of color in our poorest districts, robbing them of their inherent rights to educational and economic justice. In light of these related fiscal and educational crises, reflecting structural, social, and political power imbalances, we need more than reform of the foundation aid formula. But let me start there. Reweighting foundation aid categories as recommended by the state's Educational Conference Board is urgently needed so that levels of student poverty, disability, enrollment growth, English proficiency, and population density are more realistically considered. In addition, a new funding structure must surmount the static legislative power imbalances that favor wealthy districts with, among other advantages, fiscal safe harbors provided from state coffers, promoting rather than diminishing funding inequities. To correct this problem, the state constitution should, I'm burying my lead here. To correct this problem, the state constitution should be amended to offset this structural inequity by building in an automatic escalator so that state aid meets or exceeds the ceiling of per pupil spending in our wealthiest districts, adjusted for measures of student need and local capacity. Note that this proposal does not discourage local spending, nor recommends pie-in-the-sky abandonment of local school taxes, but rather requires the state to match funding to levels that our wealthiest districts demand for their own children. Equalization would thus be linked to the highest levels of real-world spending rather than incentivizing student ignorance. I am grateful for your time, happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you. We will be back with questions. Dr. Finnegan?
Yes, thank you. Good morning. My name is Kara Finnegan. I'm a professor of education policy and leadership at the Warner School of Education of the University of Rochester. I've conducted research and evaluations of K-12 education policies and programs at the local, state, and federal level for about 25 years. My expertise is in the areas of urban schools, I want to not do that. Urban schools, school and district improvement, accountability policy, desegregation, and educational equity. I'd like to thank you for inviting me here today. The committee is taking important steps to ensure that our state is not violating the civil rights of students, and I'm honored to be here to provide my perspective. Today, I will discuss 4 key points. Number 1, students do not have equal access to a sound basic education in New York because of racial and socioeconomic segregation between districts. Number 2, state and federal policies have exacerbated these inequities. Number 3, addressing segregation is critical for improved outcomes, resource equity, and preparing students for their future. And finally, number 4, a new approach to policy and funding equity must occur to reverse these trends. Much of what I will share today is in my book, Striving in Common, a Regional Equity Framework for Urban Schools, co-authored with Jennifer Jellison-Holm. So let me begin. Number 1, segregation between districts. We are here today to discuss whether New York State is depriving students of color of equal access to a constitutionally mandated sound basic education. Governor Cuomo recently insisted that local school districts must make sure funding reaches the poorest schools, suggesting that the local distribution of aid was what was critical to ensuring equity. Yet to ensure adequate and equitable funding, as we've been discussing today, it's important to consider whether more money could in fact better address student needs, and also given the changing demographics and enrollment patterns, whether it's time to update the metrics used in the aid formula. But I'd like to suggest to you that there is an even more critical aspect of these issues to consider as part of the discussion of civil rights violations, and that is the concentration of need that has resulted from high levels of segregation in our state school system. Attention to these broader issues is urgent, given, as mentioned earlier, New York State was singled out by UCLA's Civil Rights Project as the state with the most segregated schools in 2014. As the authors stated then, New York's record on school segregation by race and poverty is dismal now and has been for a very long time. A high concentration of poverty within a school has shown to adversely affect student achievement regardless of individual students' race or socioeconomic status. Although current levels of segregation are actually reminiscent of the pre-Brown era, its configuration has changed fundamentally. Decades ago, students from different racial and ethnic and economic backgrounds resided within the same district, but were taught in separate school buildings. While this still occurs in New York City, as discussed earlier and illustrated in the media, I want to call attention to the broader trend happening across the state in places like Rochester, Syracuse, and Buffalo, which has also been mentioned earlier. In these areas, the expansion of suburban development has led to students from different racial, ethnic, and economic backgrounds increasingly residing in separate school districts entirely, although they live just miles apart in the same metro area. The phenomenon of between-district segregation must be considered in terms of civil rights violations of students from Black and Latinx communities. Number 2, policies that have exacerbated inequities. It's important to recognize policies that got us to where we are today. As the Federal Housing Administration in 1934 and the Veterans Administration in 1944 insured private banks against loss and encouraged long-term low-cost home purchase loans, families of color were excluded from suburban options and unable to secure a loan in the city due to unfavorable neighborhood ratings. These policies fueled disinvestment in urban cores and created deep and lasting racial wealth disparities. Another significant policy development was around annexation. Previously, cities had annexed territory as their population grew outward. But by the early 20th century, suburbs fought back, incorporating into autonomous jurisdictions. In New York, legislation passed in the 60s removed annexation powers from cities and solidified the boundaries we are faced with today. The resulting multiple governments created a system of competition between municipalities for residents, businesses, and tax base. More affluent areas have zoned in higher income housing through such regulations as a prohibition on multifamily housing. Lower income areas with little power must impose high tax rates to provide basic services, leaving them unable to lure businesses or middle income residents. White and middle class flight, along with deindustrialization and the exodus of manufacturing jobs, resulted in a steadily dropping tax base. The end result is that students of color often live, attend school, and work within environments that are stacked against them. Because of this, no matter how creative or committed the superintendent and educators within districts like Rochester are, they cannot overcome these underlying structural and racial inequities. Education policy at the state level has largely ignored segregation and its impact on schools, with the exception of John King's use of federal school improvement funds to reduce socioeconomic isolation for a short period. Instead, there has been a doubling down on the technical reform approaches that conceives of the problem of school failure as the fault of those within the school system. Bureaucratic inefficiency, inadequate standards, inefficient resource allocation, and poor teaching are thus blamed. By misattributing the problem in this way, the policy solution has been putting additional pressures on low-performing schools, which serve primarily Black and Latinx students, which has had little result on performance and in fact resulted in unintended consequences such as narrowing curriculum and making these have higher rates of turnover of teachers. It is undeniable that your access to a sound basic education is determined by your zip code, but what gets lost is that this is the result of decades of policies that have created an unequal system of education in our state. And if policy can get us into this inequitable situation, policy can get us out of it. Number 3, improved outcomes. Segregation and concentrated poverty negatively affect the achievement level of students, even after controlling for a host of school quality and student background factors. The concentrated need associated with segregation can generate much higher demands on school resources and personnel, strains that then diminish the capacity of a school to improve. It is for these reasons that educators have difficulty reforming their way out of these problems. High poverty schools that are successful are often called beat the odds schools because the deck is stacked so heavily against them. But desegregation also means creating more diverse and integrated learning environments. As John Powell has noted, segregation is about the isolation of historically marginalized students from opportunity. By isolating the privileged from the marginalized, segregation sets in motion powerful political and economic forces that propel inequality. As the NAACP recognized in the cases leading up to and including Brown, it is for these political reasons that separate is very difficult to be made equal, as politics and power will almost always work against segregated schools. Research points to the positive effect of diverse learning environments on student and family outcomes, from decreased dropout rates and increased graduation rates to improved earnings and increased access to better paid jobs. Positive outcomes for all students in diverse environments include exposure to different viewpoints, increased problem solving skills, and increased comfort in interracial settings. These skills are all the same reason that organizations seek diversity to encourage creativity and innovation. These are necessary to succeed in college or careers, and thus are critical to ensuring a sound basic education. So I have discussed 3 points so far: documenting that students do not have equal access to a sound basic education because of segregation between districts, that state and federal policies have exacerbated these inequities, and that addressing segregation is critical for improved outcomes, resource equity, and preparing students for their future. So now I'll discuss my 4th point as to how to reverse these trends. What is required is a new way of thinking about the problems I have described to disrupt the advantages and disadvantages baked into our systems and structures that work against Black and Latinx students across the state. A multifaceted approach is needed that includes tax-based sharing, place-based investments, mobility policies, and a regional governance structure. In our book, and here, I draw upon legislation from Nebraska that targeted the inequities in the Omaha region to provide an example of how this could be done. Importantly, this legislation has been adopted because political power that works against equity is strong. Yet it's the only time that I know recently where a state has tried to address these issues, so it's worth understanding the components that they used. The first strategy was tax-based sharing and resource redistribution. While many state aid programs provide money to localities to compensate for low tax bases, as we've been talking about today, these programs often fail to fully address the inequities and are politically vulnerable, which we've also talked about today, subject to cuts in lean economic times, thereby creating further inequities. Tax-based sharing, on the other hand, is based on the premise that all residents in a metro area should benefit from regional growth and involves pooling and then redistributing the taxes across a metro area. The Nebraska legislature put this into place years ago as part of the learning community of Douglas and Sarpy counties. As originally designed, it pooled all local tax resources designated for education from 11 school districts in a 2-county area for the purpose of creating school funding equity across a region. Funds were then redistributed to local districts based upon a state funding formula that took into account student need. Connecting the fate of communities in terms of tax resources is a critical element in altering the competitive dynamics that undermine equity between school systems. Strategy 2 in the legislation in Nebraska was in-place investments, policies that are funded by regional resources. The second strategy is what civil rights lawyer John Powell calls in-place strategies, because these are strategies that focus on directing investment and resources into high poverty and traditionally marginalized communities. These are aimed at ensuring that communities have been historically deprived of investment are able to rebuild those communities. In Omaha, a portion of the regional tax mentioned above went towards elementary learning centers that were located in the highest poverty neighborhoods in that two-county area. In education, place-based strategies have long been exemplified in the community schools movement, a movement aimed at transforming schools into community hubs. Community schools are intended to address both educational inequity and serve as a tool for broader neighborhood investment and development. While education policy in general has been more receptive to these types of in-place investments, as we have seen in our own state, scholars like David Rusk and Patrick Sharkey point out that focusing on the redevelopment of isolated communities alone does not tackle the underlying causes of that isolation. As Rusk notes, this allows powerful institutions to shirk once again their responsibility to confront racial and economic segregation. As such, these must always be linked with other policies. Strategy 3 involves mobility policies. This component seeks to break down patterns of segregation by allowing students to move across district boundaries. While we have a small inter-district integration program like this in Rochester, it does not have some key elements in place to ensure it tackles the economic and racial isolation it was meant to solve. In Nebraska, to ensure the desired impact, both priority assignment and transportation were given to students who altered the socioeconomic balance of their school building that they were trying to attend. The ultimate goal of the program was to ensure that each school in the 11 school district area had the same proportion of low-income students as the metro-wide average. In addition to this cross-district mobility, the learning community included inter-district magnets designed to attract and enroll students from across all districts in the metro area. The legislation provided an incentive through additional per-pupil funding for students in these schools, as well as capital funds. This type of program, mobility programs like these, could be mandated or incentivized to bring districts closer to their metro-level demographics. And finally, strategy 4 was a regional governance structure. The 3 strategies described above form what one of our interviewees in Omaha called 3 legs of a stool. Continuing this analogy, the seat of the stool is oversight of implementation through a regional governing body, consisting of elected representatives from across the entire region. The learning community had a 2-tier structure, an elected governance council that oversaw regional equity goals, while local school boards had autonomy over other key decisions. A regional body like this must be given authority to make decisions on key equity issues and be able to enforce compliance given the local political dynamics. Urban school districts like Rochester and the low-income students of color they serve will continue to struggle unless these structures of segregation are tackled. And without doing so, I believe we are violating the civil rights of Black and Latinx students. We are at an important moment in time where state leadership is required given the increased inequities in our state. While some changes to the funding formula might help, more complex strategies are needed given the local political dynamics I have described. Policies that include tax-based sharing paired with place-based investments and mobility approaches, and overseen to ensure compliance with equity goals have the potential to disrupt the long patterns that we have in place. And as I mentioned, since policy got us into this, it is time for policy to get us out of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. David, you talked about some of these 29 districts. What percent of those 29 districts are majority Black or Latinx?
Very few. Brentwood is, I think there's one other. Most of them are actually poor rural school districts with declining enrollments. or very small enrollments.
Do you have data on the, and maybe you included in your testimony on, you said that there's some districts that have declined their enrollment over the, period of foundation aid, like 20%, over that period, but are still obviously getting either the same or increased amounts. Do you have data on that?
I do. I did not include like a list of those districts. The map that I talked about, it's one of the fields, a pop-up when you highlight a district, but I can certainly send you a spreadsheet with all of those listed out.
That would be very useful, thank you. And why is it that the high-need districts continue to get money under foundation aid? Is it because there is an expected local contribution and not a look at the actual local contribution?
So you're saying, why are the high
Why?
need or high
I'm
wealth?
sorry, high wealth is what I meant, sorry, yep.
Yeah, because yes, correct. There's a calculation, and the original formula said that every student would get at least $500 worth of foundation aid. So that was kind of one of the extra calculations of local aid. So they don't look at what districts are actually collecting. They have this kind of imaginary formula with multiple tax rates depending on what the wealth of the district.
And if you were, I've asked this question of a number of people, but if you were guru of the world, of this world, what would you do? Would you eliminate the foundation aid formula and substitute with something else? Would you look only at what the local contribution is and have a cap? Or
I would have probably a statewide rate and actually have one hard rate, which is the outcome of a report we did in 2016, and have a requirement that school districts actually contribute that much. And I think if you did that, I think that's where you could get it. And if you do that, you end up with a large number of school districts that would not get any foundation aid because they would have enough money on their own.
David, I don't think I understood the automatic escalator. So could you just explain that a little bit more, what your thinking is on that?
First of all, I want to address the problem, really, of sound basic education as the standard that we're working under. Senator Jackson, who referred to Michael Lavelle and CFE several times, needed to really say that Mike was pushed into that adequacy argument, that sound basic education argument, because he wasn't able to go for the equity argument that was rejected by the Court of Appeals in the Levittown decision. And so he was trying to make a legal argument to a court. I think we have to politicize a political problem. And not just say that the state's obligation is to support a sound basic education, but to support the best education for children. And so that's where the escalator comes in. Our high wealth districts care about their children to the point of Locust Valley providing $40,000 per pupil to its children. Now, why shouldn't that be a peg for all the districts in the state supported by the legislature? And they won't do it because it's politicized, and we see these structural inequities built into the legislative process. The formula is rejiggered every time that the legislature gets a hold of it to make sure that the wealthy districts, which have a power imbalance in the legislature, get their share, and they divvy up the rest. We all know about the runs, and as disgusting a term as that is, it's that disgusting a process. And so the escalator as a constitutional provision is meant to marginalize some of the politics, to give a constitutional right to districts, to state aid, to match and even exceed what Locust Valley kids get, because the Locust Valley kids actually have lower needs than the kids in our urban districts. And so the politics will come in. I don't think we can legislate entirely through a constitutional right, but we want to narrow the politics, and that's why I suggest this escalator, not as a matter of a sound educational basis, but the best education. In the real world, that real people, real parents, and real taxpayers think that their children need. That's what all children should get.
Great, and now I understand it, thank you. You talked about the rungs, or other people talked about the tiers, and said we all know about them, except we all know about them, but we don't really know about them. So
Nobody knows about them. That's the point.
I need to understand, well, yeah, David, if you want to address that, that's fine, but I mean, I would like to know a little bit more, because I've been told about them, but I don't see them written anywhere.
So they do get published on the executive budget. They publish the runs from the enacted budget. You can get them. You can request them from the state education department, which isn't exactly an executive agency. Senator Jackson said that before. I mean, their Board of Regents, as well as the commissioner, are really appointed by the state assembly for all intents and purposes. The governor does have some control over their budget. But the school aid runs, depending on the exact type of school aid, for high tax aid, which we have advocated to eliminate, it says you get the same amount you got last year. And that's what the statute says, and that's the exact same number every single year. If you haven't explored I would actually recommend looking at those runs, particularly for anybody who's savvy in Excel.
Are more than that, right?
Not really. I mean, the basically
That
they.
run, obviously, I'm aware of, but.
Yeah, they kind of, for some of the changes to the formulas, they sometimes will back into the individual calculations to make sure that the individual district that they're looking to target gets it. There was a couple years ago, there was a specific line. It was very kind of convoluted language, and it was for one specific school district that happened to be in the Assembly Majority Leader's legislative district. But there are they don't pick and choose which districts are going to get the money, really. They change the formulas so that those districts will benefit.
Right. So part of the point is the transparency of the runs is in the output, not the input. I'm sorry. Is the output. So we know when the executive budget comes out what the runs finally are, and the school boards really look over that. The superintendents need that information to know what their budget is going to be. But how those runs are arrived at is a black box.
Thank you. Kara, how long has this Nebraska system been in place? And what are the results so far?
Yeah, good question. So it went into place about 10 years ago, but it's been adapted. So it's actually lost a lot of the key equity components. That's why I was saying it's, unfortunately, the political wills have shifted it. But it was in place long enough that they were already showing promising results academically for those areas that had been so distressed. One of the things that, as I mentioned, that in education policy, the place-based approaches are the most palatable, and that's really what mostly has remained. So that's the key. That's why I wanted to emphasize that usually that alone isn't going to solve these problems.
So just as a political matter, people rejected the desegregation effectively of the districts, or local districts that were high wealth wanting to just have more autonomy?
So what happened is, like in the Omaha area, like here, there are a number of districts in a county area. And they had been just operating as they do here in segregated ways. The components that were supposed to disrupt that were the ones that required the sharing of the local property taxes. That's the common levy that they had. That was the one that the suburban districts fought greatly against. In the end, at the state level, there were some indications that actually lowered some of the state aid after redistributing those funds locally. So there was an overall, gain for the state, but the local districts wanted the power back in terms of the amounts. They were allowed to tax above that rate locally. It's just they had to have a portion that went to this regional redistribution. also, sorry, one other thing, there was also the things that were also weakened. So out of all the components, they still have the elected governance structure. They still have the place-based component, but they don't have the interdistrict piece or the mobility piece. Those funds dried up. So again, it's how you incentivize through funding versus through mandates. And these are different approaches to do that. And politically, I'm not going to say it's easy. These are challenging.
Alex? I did, but Steve asked his question, so, no, okay.
Great. Thank you so much again for your testimony. This is Vivian Louie again. I have a question for Kara, and it follows up very nicely from what Alexandra has just raised, which is, so you talked about tax-based sharing, resource redistribution, regional government structure, mobility strategies, based on the case study from Nebraska. So I was wondering if you had to pick just one, right? I mean, realistically, what would be the most feasible, the one thing that you think would have the most potential for traction in New York State? And how do you think that would look like? What would be the challenges? How would you get there?
Well, I would say you need all of them, but since you're forcing me, I think that the challenge you have is that some of the things like mobility programs are a short-term solution, and things like place-based strategies are long-term solutions. So, I mean, what some places across the country have done is they've gone with the short-term solutions, but they don't conquer everything. So it has to always be part of the bigger puzzle. The redistribution of resources, I think, again, is one that just really could be very critical. It takes different thinking about how we've funded schools and whose local property tax that is. So I think that politically that could be a challenge, but that could have a very big impact. So I guess it depends on, in terms of prioritizing, the quickest one or the easiest one in a way would be incentivizing that you allow movement across the boundaries. But these other two are probably going to have a longer term impact over time.
Ann?
I just want to ask about, you were talking about the different mobility policies, and you talked about the intra-district magnet schools. I don't know if you're aware of the issue right here in New York. What do you believe the criteria should be for admission into these intra-district magnet schools, considering that some districts have been so disadvantaged for such a long period of time? How to make those more fair and equitable access for all students?
Yes, so the interdistrict magnets that at least were in Nebraska, they focused on, they did not have the same kind of criteria to get in, like the test that's been brought up in New York City. They did have themes. I mean, a lot of times the magnets are thematic so that they draw people around science or arts or things like that. Another thing that they did to, I think, help us a little bit is in some places, like even Rochester, the movement across boundaries is moving out from the city to the suburbs. Interdistrict magnets had the opportunity of moving kids into the city. And so that's a really critical difference in terms of how many of the interdistrict programs operate. So I had mentioned one, the interdistrict, just moving people across boundaries doesn't necessarily have these kinds of magnet approaches. It's just whatever schools are operating, you're changing the assignment procedures to allow kids in to change the demographics. But the magnets themselves could be used strategically in two ways. So one is by allowing different kinds of opportunities that are not provided right now in some districts, and also by shifting some of those resources back to the city.
Iris? I might go later. Okay. Earl? Stephen?
A quick question for Kara. You mentioned or just to clarify here, for the regional governing structure, that's comprised of both school boards and an elected council. You also mentioned elected officials. When you say elected officials, is that the members of the elected council, or is that the separate state and city?
Sorry, I'll clarify, yes. It was a new governing body that was elected to represent that two-county area. And actually, school board members were not, so thinking of it as a new elected advisory board to make sure equity was happening across that region. And school board members and superintendents, I guess it was more superintendents actually, had an advisory role, but they didn't have a vote. And so one of the reasons was to bring in new people that were in different parts of that region to make sure all of the different equity goals were being met. So in terms of elected officials, it's a new group that was elected as a regional body.
And to follow up on that, was there a lot of collaboration between the existing elected officials or representatives and this new council?
Well, that was some of the frustration, I guess, from the superintendents in the suburbs, is that they didn't have a voting role. But I think that was done intentionally to move this into a new structure, rather to move away from those competing dynamics that exist. So I would say collaboration did exist in getting this off the ground to some degree. Like many places across the country, when these things happen, it's because of some impending lawsuit, and that was happening in Nebraska. So there was some sort of forced collaboration as a result of some of the trends that were happening towards other things like consolidation. This was a sort of a workaround, and I think people were more willing to get on board at that moment. And then some of the political shifts is why it's gotten lessened in its impact.
David, I have a follow-up question. In your scheme, how do localities tax? And like if you're matching to the highest, matching the funding to the highest levels, what would make the Locust Valleys continue to fund locally under your scheme?
I've been knocking my head against the wall about this for a long time, and I think the desire of localities, super local districts like Locust Valley, sort of demand the property tax right. They want to fund their schools to the max, and so I don't attack it in this proposal. I play some jujitsu with it and say if that's what they're going to be taxing, that's what the state ought to match. Now, they shouldn't give Locust Valley any more, and again, that's why I think it needs to be moved to a constitutional level rather than a statutory level, because we've heard again and again, the first panel, this panel, that the politics gets in the way of equity. But my idea of equity is not lowest common denominator equity to bring down the top, it's to bring up the bottom, and that's what the escalator does.
But isn't the escalator tied to highest spending district?
Right, so let them spend as much as they want. So
What will incentivize, I guess you're saying that they'd be incentivized to spend anyway, even with a property tax cap that's in effect?
Well, so the property tax to some degree gets in the way. I'm not a proponent of the property tax, but if you had the property tax cap, obviously they can surmount it if they want, and some districts do. So it works with the cap or without the cap.
Thank you.
We have time for, I wanted to ask Kara, just because I feel like it is a big topic of real conversation increasingly, the whole idea of mobility and making sure that individual districts or schools mirror the overall demographics. How close did Omaha get to it? And I'm not understanding how it disappeared. And then what were all the implementation challenges of that? Because that's a huge feat that I'm not aware of any district that has accomplished that.
Yes. I mean, a lot of times these are goals that we're striving for, and closing that gap is the way places end up looking at it versus actually reaching it, unfortunately. I think that so they didn't accomplish it because this has been now dismantled over time. But some of the things in terms of things that came up as challenges were whether there were, whether the suburban districts in particular we're allowing seats. And so this becomes like a compliance issue. Who's overseeing whether this is happening? There were issues around transportation in terms of the transportation was required if the student was changing those demographics, but whether that was always happening wasn't clear. So a lot of it had to do with oversight, which is why, I mean, they did have this regional governance board, but I think there are probably more steps that would need to be in place in terms of reporting and transparency to be sure that it's having its ultimate effect.
My comment, I didn't mean sticking, how, did they make any movement, even for a temporary period of time?
Yeah, I mean, even in Rochester, if you look at the percentages that we have in terms of students moving from the city school district to the suburban areas, there's differences in those in getting closer towards the metro area demographics. But in places like Rochester, where it's voluntary in terms of the school, the suburban districts opening up seats, and there's no financial incentive. I mean, there is a financial incentive because the money that comes from the city is more than they would get in state aid in their suburban district. But the incentive isn't enough, unfortunately, to really push this issue. So I think you'd either have to incentivize it more or mandate it. And also, you want it to go both ways, which it doesn't do in New York or in a lot of places across the country. It's just a one-way out. So that's draining a lot of resources out of the city and not moving resources back in. So you'd want to make sure that the details are important, I think, in getting closer to the equity issue.
And then, sorry, last follow-up. You ended and started with policy got us here, policy can get us back out.
Yeah.
What would be your policy recommendations specifically? And then as it relates to what you would deem the root causes that go well beyond, right, the state of education and equity today?
Yeah. Well, so, in Nebraska, what they did was they had legislation that forced the tackling of these issues through these multiple components. So I think that, even though Vivian wanted me to pick one, I think, thinking about both the redistribution of aid in a new way in metro areas to make sure equity is happening at that level. And then these issues around using some of that redistributed aid to have investments in the most challenging areas that's not just an education issue, but a lot of times through those kinds of investments, you do bring in health and housing and other issues that can start to just alleviate a lot of the problem is around the concentration of need in multiple areas. And so you can target resources to address some of those things. I think the mobility piece, though, is key as we have in our state these boundaries that I think we're more likely to use some of the approaches, and I'll have it in my written testimony for you that you can look at more closely, but these approaches are sort of because we have too many of these autonomous units competing with each other. So it's trying to figure out at the state level what you do to allow those to remain in place, but to not have the impact that they're having on the education of kids.
David, in your analyses, have you found a discriminatory impact based on race?
It's not something that CBC has generally looked at in preparation for today. I did look at it, I should say, and certainly the largest funding delta being for a majority minority district. Them taking up about half of that $83 million shortfall was certainly of note. And then we look at New York City as one school district. That's how the state treats it. I know a lot of the conversation has treated it as separate districts. But I think New York City is almost so separate from the rest of the state that I think it kind of would warp the level of analysis that we do.
And when you talked about the foundation aid formula having a cost side problem as well, what were you referring to?
The regional cost index, yeah, which lumps in New York City and the Lown and is based on data from 2006. The actual, they don't even pretend, they just say this is what the regional cost index is in statute. There's no reference to updating it.
Great, thank you. Does anybody have any more questions?
Thank you. It's actually, again, to follow up, David, you mentioned with your first point about faulty calculations of local revenues.
Uh-huh.
So do you have a particular recommendation about how that could be dealt with?
One would be to use, the formula has 4 different calculations of what a local share would be, in addition to an automatic $500 per kid, to eliminate the $500, and then also have one calculation statewide. The current calculation basically has different calculations as you move up the kind of the wealth of districts, and it kind of flattens it out so that as you get wealthier, there's a different calculation, so you'll still get something. And we think if you just did one, then high wealth districts would not get any aid, and that's okay.
Thank you very much for coming and testifying. We may come back to you. Any submissions you want to make in addition to your written testimony, please feel free to do so. Thank you. We're going to adjourn now until 12:15, and our next panel will begin at 12:15.
Yeah.
Are we missing somebody? We are missing somebody. Were you in touch with Sean? I'm in touch with.
I spoke to him recently, he's definitely coming.
Okay, you know.
He was flying in, he's now at Vanderbilt, so maybe. he'll probably fly.
Oh, right, okay. We're gonna reconvene. We're missing one of our panelists. I think he was flying in, so we'll just put him as a third person on our panel. Anyway, thank you. Without further ado, if we could start with Peter Cookson, who's at the Learning Policy Institute at the moment.
All right, thank you very much. It's good to be here. Good afternoon, Chairman Corey and members of the committee. Thank you for your invitation and to participate in the hearing. My name is Peter Cookson. I'm a senior researcher with the Learning Policy Institute, LPI. The Institute conducts and communicates independent, high-quality research to improve education policy and practice, working with policymakers, researchers, educators, community groups, and others. We seek to advance evidence-based policies that support empowering and equitable learning for each and every child. I'm honored to be here today. These comments today summarize my written testimony, and the written testimony really makes the case that funds invested wisely have a measurable impact on the positive learning outcomes for low-income students and students of color. And that's basically what we're going to address. Today, I will share research that explores the relationship between school funding levels and student outcomes and its relationship between funding teacher quality and student outcomes, provide an example from another state that has leveraged school funding reforms to improve student outcomes, and conclude with recommendations to help ensure that all students receive a sound basic education in New York. The Foundation Aid formula is one of the most progressive, as we've heard in other testimony, progressive in the country in terms of ensuring the equitable distribution of educational resources. Unfortunately, because it is currently underfunded and because wealthy local districts can add on much more funding from their local property tax base, the actual distribution of revenue to schools is regressive. It is highly unequal. It does not ensure that funding is related to pupil needs. As a result, high-need school districts serving low-income students of color do not have the resources they need to enable and empower their students to reach their academic and creative potential. My written testimony summarizes a number of national and state studies which show that investments in education, particularly the education of low-income children, reap very large benefits for achievement, graduation rates, educational attainment, employment, and later life learnings. For example, a recent study examined the long-term outcomes for more than 15,000 children born between 1955 and 1985 who were followed through 2011, linking data about their school experiences and life outcomes to that of school spending and school finance reforms. For students from low-income families who had 20% more spent on them over 12 years of school, graduation rates increased by 23 percentage points, their household incomes as adults increased by 52%, and their odds of living in poverty were nearly eliminated. A recent study focused solely on New York uncovered the same relationship. Increased spending is associated with higher student achievement in both math and English, even controlling for many other factors that typically influence school performance. After studying the New York data, the authors conclude, this study strengthens the case that school resources matter and sustained financial investments can help districts maintain and improve the quality of public education. So funding levels matter. However, how those funds are spent matters equally. This is key. Linda Darling-Hammond, LPI's president and CEO, and other scholars have convincingly demonstrated that money spent wisely results in creating teaching and learning systems that provide excellent education for all students. In my written testimony, I review a number of studies that illustrate that qualified and experienced teachers matter for student learning, and their availability, in turn, is dependent on salaries and working conditions that depend on district funding. For instance, a study of teachers in New York City found that students' achievement growth in elementary and middle school mathematics was most enhanced by having a fully certified teacher who had graduated from a university-based pre-service teacher program, who had had a strong academic background in math, who had more than 2 years of experience. Students' achievement was hurt most by having an inexperienced teacher on a temporary license, a teaching profile most common in high-minority, low-income schools. Disparities between school districts per pupil spending in New York are dramatic. Average, as I'm sure you've heard in other testimony, average per pupil spending data camouflages serious funding inequities. In 2015, revenues per pupil varied from less than $15,000 to more than $70,000 per pupil. These differences in pupil expenditures are significant in terms of the educational opportunities available to low-income students and students of color, who are most impacted by these disparities. A recent study by Education Trust found the following in 2018. New York ranked 48th out of 50 states in gaps in state and local revenues per student between districts serving the most and fewest students in poverty. New York ranked 44th out of 50 states in gaps in state and local revenue per student between districts serving the most and fewest students of color. We have, in effect, not one but two public school systems in New York. One for students living in stable communities with sufficient resources to provide a sound basic education. Another located in communities of concentrated poverty, quite often also communities of color. Recent research makes it evident that districts with the highest percentage of students of color consistently have the lowest median salaries for teachers in the state. Less funding results in less qualified and fewer teachers. The turnover rate for teachers in high-poverty districts serving black students is double that of low-poverty white districts. These are the kind of disparities the Foundation Aid formula was meant to address. This comes to the heart of the puzzle. How is it that New York, with its commitment to quality education, still does not provide adequate funds so that all districts in the state are able to provide their students a sound basic education? The short answer is the current Foundation Aid formula is underfunded, and the lack of funding disproportionately impacts those districts educating low-income and students of color. Funding for special education and support for English language learners is also underfunded. According to the Alliance for Quality Education, 2/3 of the districts in New York State are still owed Foundation Aid money. By contrast, 100% high-needs school districts with majority Black and Latinx students are owed Foundation Aid. There are 25 school districts that are both high-need and majority Black and Latinx. The students in these districts represent 80% of the Black and Latinx students in the state and 69% of the economically disadvantaged students in the state. These 25 districts, according to the Alliance, are owed 62% of all Foundation Aid money. According to the Education Law Center, the state remains $40 billion in arrears in funding obligations to New York State school children. Other states have recognized the role of school funding in advancing learning for all. We heard a little bit earlier about New Jersey. After 3 decades of litigation regarding deeply inequitable funding, New Jersey made a major investment in parity for low-wealth, high-minority districts beginning in 1996-97. By 2007, New Jersey had sharply increased its standing on reading and mathematics assessments nationally, ranking in the top 5 states in all subject areas and grade levels on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. These findings and research suggest 3 considerations for the Commission and for the state policies in your effort to ensure equal educational opportunities for the children of New York, especially those that have been historically farthest from opportunity. School funding, 1. School funding in New York State should be based on student need, with greater state funding allocated to districts serving higher proportions of high-need students as the Foundation Aid formula prescribes. In short, the Foundation Aid formula should be fully funded. 2. This principle should be extended to more adequate and equitable funding for special education students. 3. Districts should be enabled to hire and keep well-prepared educators by coupling funding resources that support improved salaries and working conditions in previously under-resourced districts with stronger educator preparation, induction, and mentoring for novices, and ongoing professional learning. The evidence is clear. The return on investment on educating all the state's children so that they reach and exceed their potential will result in a larger tax base, lower crime rates, less dependency on public assistance. But there is an even deeper reason to invest in the state's children. Democracy requires a high level of civic participation and knowledge from its citizens if it is to thrive. As Chief Justice Warren noted in the Brown opinion, education is the very foundation of good citizenship, and the opportunity to assess education where the state has undertaken to provide it is a right that must be made available to all on equal terms. Education is the only and best way to build a democracy that works on behalf of all. Children who are deprived of a sound basic education make democracy smaller, less inclusive, and ultimately more fragile. The stakes are very high, and the solution is at hand. So thank you for this opportunity. I'd be happy to answer any questions the members might have, or Katie have for me.
Thank you very much. We'll do questions at the end of the panel. Andrew?
Thank you very much. My name is Andrew Van Alstyne. I'm the Deputy Director of Education and Research with ASBO New York, the Association of School Business Officials, or organizations, a professional association representing business officials and all the ancillary members in the office. We have approximately 2,500 members covering most school districts outside of New York City and all of the BOCES. I'm going to start by talking about foundation aid, but I'm going to skip CFE background of foundation aid since Mike Rebell and Senator Jackson and everyone else being the eighth panel of 8, I'm going to just make that assumption. But I do want to talk a little bit about some things I've either not heard or we really emphasize, which is so $3.4 billion is the current foundation aid still due. That'll rise again by next year to roughly $4 billion, I would guess. The rise comes from even as enrollment drops in our schools, student need is growing rapidly. The foundation formula covers 3 categories of student need: English language learners, students with disabilities, and economic hardship. All 3 are associated with the incidence of students of color in the data, but primarily economic hardship and English language learners. And so if we look at first need resource capacity categories, which is how the state breaks down districts into need, and these aren't perfect because they were created in 2008 and haven't changed. But the state classifies 6 categories for traditional public schools: New York City, the Big 4, high need urban suburban school districts, high need rural school districts, average need and low need. And if we look at the first 3, which is the Big 5 and high need urban suburban districts, those 3 categories have between 63 and 74% of their enrollment are Black and Latino, and foundation aid still due per pupil is well above the state average. So in the Big 4, it's almost $2,000 per student, and high need urban suburban school districts, it's $3,800 per student. So a staggering amount of money, and these are districts that rely generally on the state for a plurality, if not a majority, of their funding. So they don't have the local fiscal capacity generally to make up for this, which is why they're classified as high need. The last few budget sessions, the governor has made an extensive push to try to abandon the foundation aid formula. I heard some mention of that. Senator Jackson spoke about it. I think this year he may be the most outspoken in saying that he sees it as settled and funded. Beyond the lawsuits, he just sees the state as settled. And outside of just the money that is owed under the formula, I think that's a viewpoint that's very different from our organization and state policy, which is it's not an arbitrary not an arbitrary number, and it's not unrestricted funding. It's, in theory, evidence-based, right? So we have quibbles with the formula, with the weightings, all of that stuff. I mean, the data's out of date. Everyone sort of knows this. But it is based on what does it cost to provide the education that we are constitutionally and probably morally obligated to provide, and
how much does it cost to provide it for students who have additional needs, and how much of that can a district provide locally, and what does the state need to do to ensure that that's not a barrier, right? Moving it to just the general source of unrestricted funding abandons all of that. We were very pleased to see both legislatures and the one-house budgets, called for a significant phase-in. The regents in their state aid proposal called for probably the most aggressive phase-in because they included inflation, which no one else does. And what I was excited to see in the enacted budget, while the increase was the same roughly as the year before, 8 of the 10 tiers that spelled out what the increase are made reference to either how far a district is towards being funded or how much foundation aid still due is there for that district. So that is beyond the minimums, and there's the minimum every district got, there's the minimum for small city districts, and there's the minimum for non-wealthy rural schools, essentially. All of the rest of the increase was targeted to districts that had not yet been fully funded, which made it a much more progressive foundation aid increase this year than the prior year. And if we go beyond the need, resource, capacity categories, because outside of the big 5, they're very broad, and we look at deciles of combined wealth ratio, we see even more striking results. So the least wealthiest decile, student body is roughly 52, 53% Black and Latino. Foundation aid still due per pupil is about $3,000, all the way up to the wealthiest decile, which is 3% Black, 15% Latino, and $72 due per pupil in foundation aid. That being said, I want to use these deciles to also talk about Save Harmless, which we've heard about a lot. And the point I want to make here is, outside of the lowest 2 and the single wealthiest decile, if we look at that 70% of districts in between, there's almost no relationship between decile and the number of districts that are on Save Harmless. Because while Save Harmless is the providence of that wealthy suburban district people think of, most districts that are on Save Harmless are small rural districts that are average or high need and frankly wouldn't function if they didn't get it. Right? So if they weren't Save Harmless and if they got their foundation aid formula, because of the fixed costs that they have, it would be an existential crisis for them. All right, so I mentioned enrollment declines. In the last 5 years, 20% of districts saw enrollment increases, 32% saw 0 to 5% declines, 30% saw 5 to 10% declines, and 18% of districts in the state lost more than 10% of enrollment. So something is probably going to give with those numbers in the near future. Also, I want to talk about the community schools set aside. I heard positive things about community schools earlier. They are great ideas. The problem with the way community schools funding exists right now is it's not actual additional funding. It's a restriction or a carve-out, which makes it much easier politically for there to be enormous increases in community schools aid vis-a-vis any other category. So community schools aid this year increased 25%. Right? No other budget line in the categoricals went up more than 10%. Right? Why did it go up 25%? Because that's not actual additional money. It's just a restriction. It's a restriction that hits the highest need school districts. Right? In no way is this a negative comment about community schools. It's a comment about if you want these programs, they should be pullouts and they should be a separate categorical. And if we look at how much of their foundation aid is represented by the restriction of community schools, in the big 4, it's about 4%. Right? For districts that are thousands of dollars per student away from being funded, further restricting their foundation aid that they do receive is a real challenge. It's also a significant challenge because there were enormous increases to hit the minimum of $100,000 per district for very, very small districts as well. So ASBO, our primary argument or recommendation is fully funding the foundation aid before addressing it. We had a task force we convened a few years ago, and I will include a link in my written testimony to the report from that. But the foundation aid task force made a number of recommendations, some of which I'm assuming you've heard. But for example, measuring poverty in the 2000 census is wildly out of date. The move from free priced lunch data to direct certification data, which will hopefully be underway because SED has been instructed to collect direct certification data for the last 3 years. And it was actually used in the budget this year in one of those foundation aid tiers, which means that that big database that makes up the runs includes direct cert data. So that is available. Eliminating the caps and floors would make the formula much more valuable. And we see this as a first step, and it's about, the focus here and the analysis here is on the resources for adequacy between districts, because we don't have significant data on intra-district dynamics in terms of school finance. We have a single year's reporting of budgeted numbers from 76 school districts that was filed last year, and those data are useful, but have some flaws. But it's also important to remember that funding is only one part of the solution. So efficient use of resources, strategic use of resources can make enormous differences. Highly qualified teachers and principals, class sizes, sufficient and adequate instructional space that support learning, support services for at-risk students. These are all some of the many offerings that are critically valuable for achieving a sound basic education for all students. So funding as part of this, we fully believe that we need to fund the foundation aid formula and then look at how can we strengthen and improve it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Peter, how would you measure need? Do you think that the foundation aid formula measures need, assuming it were brought up to date in terms of census data, et cetera, how would you measure need? Do you think it should be changed? And I'm going to ask Andrew the same question. So.
Well, I think in other research that we've done that's sort of mentioned in the written testimony, I think you need to measure need in a very comprehensive way. I think you have to think of out-of-school factors as well as within-school factors if you really want to understand what the needs are of children who come from low-income families, and also, and low income's a bit of a euphemism, poor families, and they're often students of color. So where I would start from was to do a comprehensive understanding of what the learning needs are. And that would include nutrition, it would include safety, it would include all kinds of things that support systems that the young students need that often don't get. I've done quite a bit of research here in New York City in the past, and you can go into a classroom and there are students who obviously can't see very well, but they don't have glasses. There are students who may have hearing issues. There are students sleeping in the classroom often because they have a job or they get home late. The actual conditions of the life of the students needs to be the place to start from. Once you have a global sense of that, then I think you can begin to back in and sort of back engineer what it would cost. And you see, that's why this is going to cost more than it would a kid in the average kid. There's lots of variation, but the average kid in a suburb, because they have that support system. So I think the argument that somehow by even equalizing it somehow makes it equitable is basically flawed. They're not all starting from the same starting position. And here's the other piece to this, is that I think what's missing from this dialogue is the idea of cumulative disadvantage. People who are fortunate enough to be middle class and above everybody has their struggles and problems and so forth. But if you're poor, and particularly if you're a person of color in the United States today, the disadvantages that you encounter are cumulative. And while the schools can't overcome all of that, they're the only intervention that we really have to actually make a difference in these kids' lives. So that's how I would start thinking about it. I wouldn't take out the green shade immediately. I'd try to understand what the problem was.
But it would be very hard to do it student by student.
Well, I think you can, if you know the area, if you know the world that they're living in, I don't think it's exactly student by student. I think it's community by community. Maybe school districts are sometimes divided, but parts of school districts, you have a pretty good sense of what most all the kids are going through.
Thank you. Andrew?
I think there's three sort of categories of response to that. The first is measurement. So if we have, I think that fits economic hardship. And I like the way the foundation aid formula balances poverty with the broader measure because the poverty line is artificially low. At the same time, being actually in poverty is much more of a hardship than just being economically challenged. So it deserves an additional weight. Moving from free and reduced price lunch data to direct certification data, ensuring that the rates are equalized because you get overall lower responses in direct cert, would give more timely and accurate data, and also make it less of a hardship for school districts that want to use the community eligibility provision to provide free meals for their students that are somewhat concerned about losing their free and reduced price lunch rate, because what's the incentive for kids to fill out the form when they get the lunch anyway? So that one's measurement, that's I think straightforward. One is weighting, and given who was in your panel yesterday, I'm sure I'm not the first person to mention this. But we worked with Professor John Yinger on looking at student weights, and it's very clear that the weights we have are either based on research that's out of date or based on arbitrary choices that are out of date. So looking at updating the weightings, and then the third is overlapping or concentration. So overlap or concentration of student need. It's going to, if you have a student in poverty, that student will have challenges that you'll need to meet. If 20% of your students or 40% of your students are in poverty, that's exponential. It's not just a single cumulative or thing you can add up. So looking at a way to look at the concentration and the interaction of need, and those would be probably research-based.
Just picking up on Peter's point, that equalization really isn't equity necessarily. How would you change the weighting so that so that you actually maybe overcompensate for high need districts and or overweight them, so to speak?
Overweight for high need districts.
Instead of seeking equalization and then getting a number that applies for equalization, by what factor should we be providing more education dollars to high need districts than low need districts?
I think the weighting approach, I think would be valuable. And that's the theory behind it, is that those are the categories of need it identifies. If you want to assign additional categories of need, you can include them, and then you wait for their incidence. I also think, again, as I said, looking for interaction or cumulative effects, because those have a magnifying effect. I should say, we measure those three categories of need. We also wait for sparsity. So there is a fourth dimension of need measured in the foundation aid formula. But I think that's one way.
That should continue, the sparsity?
The factor? If the idea is what does it cost, what are the factors that significantly change the cost of providing sound basic education? Absolutely, for two big reasons. One is there's an overlap of hardship in rural areas, but also fixed costs and the lack of economies of scale. It's very expensive, relatively speaking, to be a very small rural district. And they often have very low cushions, very low reserves, so they are unable to weather fiscal challenges. So I think it's appropriate.
Peter, would you build your system from the ground up, as Dr. Quesada yesterday suggested, meaning you would look at the district, look at what their needs are, and then kind of build it up, as opposed to the foundation aid formula approach? Or would you use the foundation aid formula approach and tweak it?
Well, I would, since we have the foundation aid formula, it makes some sense to retain it and not know what else we would do. I think we were just talking about the weights. I think the thing about the weights is to figure out what the real weights are, to figure out what the real costs, what the real price students pay for being poor or being minorities in the country. I'm not quite sure how to do that mathematically. You'd have to think about that. But I think that's more in the line that I would think of. I think if you go into the schools and I mean, how do you assess this in a way that really makes sense in the real world of real students? And there's no librarian, and they don't have, I'm sure you've heard testimony about some of this stuff yesterday. They don't have computers, and they don't have adequate booths and so forth and so on. Someone has to make an assessment of that in a realistic way before you can start saying, well, what would be the right weight? Because the weight would probably be a great deal more than just 1.1, 1.2. It'd probably be quite a bit more. And many of the students do have special education needs. And there's a variety of those needs. It goes from something that's fairly mild to something that's rather severe. And so you need to be frank about that, and English language learners as well. Some students pick it up quickly, and other students take more work. So you need a real needs assessment, I think, in a district of what the student needs are in the larger context.
Andrew, you talked about eliminating the caps on floors. Can you speak to that a little bit? And which caps are we talking about?
So they would be caps on wealth and income, depending on the various measure. But right now, the floors are really underemphasize how poor some districts are or how little property wealth they have. And so a significant number of districts are made to look much wealthier than they are. And then at the extreme, a much smaller number of districts that are far off the scale in terms of property wealth per student. You know, some districts' property wealth per student might be $3 million, but it's treated as if it's much, much, much less than that. So the floors and the caps will give us a much more accurate view. But we also would not, our organization also believes that state aid's a partnership, or education's a partnership between the state and localities. And so even as you eliminate caps and floors, there should be a minimum, and oftentimes it's very small, but the state sort of has a role to play in every school district, whether it's foundation aid, building aid, transportation aid, textbook aid, et cetera, that there's some sort of partnership there, even if it's relatively small.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to start. Stephen, do you have any questions? Earl? Iris?
Out questions as we're close to wrapping our speakers. So one question is, we've been spending a lot of the last 2 days talking about the formula, how to make it more precise, how to update it, how to perfect it. And I guess in the back of my head is, gosh, there must be some cost, right, to greater complexity, greater precision, as with anything, the overrulifying. And so I'm interested to hear how we should be thinking about that. The more precise, probably the more complex. And then the second question is we also heard from other presenters the idea of, formula is formula, but at the end of the day, every child, all they care about is that they have a great education, great library, access to resources. So we just have to make that happen. So I guess how should we also think about, outside of funding, are there other approaches, right? Like you could imagine a world where the state is more involved in education to make sure that that education is truly delivered at an equitable level.
So beyond so if we can start with the assumption that we fund the foundation aid formula and fix it and we have the sufficient resources, our organization, the next step would be look at strategic resource use. And so we encourage our members to consider these things, work on these things. We had a symposium, we have an annual symposium every year. Last year, ours focused on weighted student funding for allocating resources within a district. You may have heard of this. So our panelists included Ian Rosenblum, who was here yesterday, and you saw Larry Spring spoke. His school business official, Kim Lewis, was on our panel because Schenectady is trying to launch a smaller version of this. And so it's about how do you use those resources? And that's something that I think districts are best positioned to know. I think one of the troubling things we saw in the last budget proposal from the governor was taking so 76 districts last year had to submit their budget numbers by building. Okay. So the governor then proposed that if they identified high need underfunded schools in a district, they would have to dedicate a set percentage of their foundation aid increase. All right. The problem there is if you actually look at the submissions and the data, a lot of those costs are probably out of a district's immediate control, right? So the biggest factor looking at districts in terms of understanding variation is teacher experience, right? By contract, most districts aren't going to be able to reallocate teachers to try to meet that. And so a state dictate trying to address this is going to, I think, state dictates that don't address underlying issues are going to run into challenges.
Yeah.
How would you direct, how would you ensure that the monies go to the highest need districts?
So within a district to the highest need schools? So it's a districts that are working on this are compensating with, a district might compensate with additional teacher aides. And it might be if there's an incident of English language learners that are responsible, because these categorizations are based on need, with additional supports, or some of them are based on, rather than having students with disabilities served in all schools, having them a central focus within one school. And so putting additional resources there. But the larger point, I think, is that there are enough variations within districts that it's hard to mandate an allocation without addressing the underlying issue. Right? The underlying issue is especially the Taylor Law, and mandating change in collective bargaining is just a non-starter right now. So if we're not going to address that underlying cause, the state could offer incentives for qualified, skilled teachers to teach in high-need schools. Right.
Just to address your question, I think there's a very large body of research about that statistically demonstrates what's efficient, effective, and has a return to society in terms of the kinds of programs that you implement in a school. And I don't think it's actually a huge mystery. And I think sometimes this gets lost in the conversation, because what would have the greatest impact for whatever dollars that you had to spend? We know the biggest variable is the quality of the teachers, which I touched on, but that's just a little taste of what's a very large body of research. Class size makes a huge difference. It's particularly for low-income students. Up-to-date learning materials. I won't go through the whole thing, but there is a way to think about how to fix schools that isn't all that. It has been not only experientially, people know it, educators know it, but it's been often made clearer by research. And the other way I would just think about this whole process, that it's basically an algorithm. Every student has an algorithm, but they're not all that different. I mean, we all share a lot in common. And if you want to get to the end goal, let's say academically, but there are other goals to achieve as well. Social emotional learning, there are lots of things, graduation, that you can think of that particularly in the 21st century, that students need to have. That's the other piece to this, that if you go into low-income schools and they're not being prepared for the skills that they need today, I mean, they're in deep trouble. I mean, real trouble, because even relatively low-paying manual jobs are disappearing. And so there's a big mismatch between the education system and the economic system. So I know you're just looking at the funding piece of it, but I think if you divorce it too much from the actual what would you do to make it work, it gets a little abstract.
So I guess, sorry, that gets to my question, should the state be doing more? You can imagine the state coming out, I'm making this up in response to what you just said.
Yeah.
A curriculum that's more
Yeah.
21st century or even 22nd century. So should the state be doing anything else? And then I would love to get you all's thinking around what's the right, how to think about complexity costs, right?
Yeah.
To get more precise with the formula.
Yeah. I mean, you raise really a good question. I don't have a glib answer for this, to be honest with you. I don't have some simple answer. You're right. The more complex it becomes, it could be good, but it could also be lots of process, lots of details that get lost in the whole process. I think you have to have certain principles by which guide you, and those should be the ones that matter the most. and not get too lost. I know everyone here has talked about the politics, and I'm not naive about the politics, but I think if you're setting policy, you need to think about what's best for the kids. And, I mean, you can't control all those other political pieces anyway. So that's how I would start thinking about it. And that would probably take, you know, a pretty sophisticated approach to it. But what are the principles that guide your thinking? That'd be my approach.
Andrew, why do you think Governor Cuomo has called CFE foundation aid a ghost of the past?
Because it would require the state to spend billions of dollars. I mean, I think that, I really think it comes down to the spending. And I think there was a big push by the legislature, I think fairly clearly, a big push to try to increase foundation aid. And it doesn't seem an accident that it's the same dollar amount that it was last year. That seems some sort of statement.
Do you have a view? I would ask both of you this. Many commentators have spoken about the fact that New York has the highest spending per pupil of any state, and tout it as the reason why money is not doesn't equate to outcomes. Can you comment on that? I mean, specifically, what I'm asking is if there's something, if there's something underlying that we're missing.
There's a lot. Well, essentially, one, New York has not had a wave of teacher strikes that have swept the nation, and the reason is because our teacher pay has increased relative to inflation, which is not the case in a lot of states, and they are facing problems because of that. There's also variation within the state and incredibly high-cost areas that obscure. You know, the mean is not a very useful number to use because of the enormous variance. And there's also additional mandates that New York's public schools do that other schools don't in most states. So we transport private school kids up to 25 miles out of district. Right? We provide those schools with textbooks. We have a whole raft of mandates that increase the costs, whether it's education, transportation, building a project, capital costs. So I think there are a lot of regulations that also contribute to that.
I think, you know, you sort of have to begin with a couple of social facts on the ground. New York is extremely segregated. So the fact that it has a high per student spending doesn't necessarily mean that applies to all the schools, all the students in the state. It doesn't do a student who's going to a under-resourced school that has newly licensed teachers or not licensed teachers, who doesn't have a playground, who has very few learning opportunities, to say to them, well, actually, you're in a very high spending state. I mean, to be blunt, I don't think it means anything, to be honest with that kid and to the families. And we're talking about millions of students. 51% of the kids in New York State are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. 21% of the kids in New York State are living in poverty. And that, again, sort of, that's a fairly low bar. There's plenty of working people and so forth who would be not considered poor, who don't have a great deal of resources. So in one way, I think the conversation is sort of disoriented. And you do have incredible wealth alongside of it in New York, and Westchester, and parts of Manhattan, and Long Island, and mostly in those areas. And it's two different worlds. And I don't think it does kids in either very rural areas or small cities like Rochester that are very poor, and lots of kids in New York, to not recognize that you're going to take more. You're going to take more to make them even get to the starting line to the same place.
Is the cost of teacher pensions a factor in the higher cost, if you will, in New York?
Yes. Teacher pensions, and then in recent years, increasing healthcare costs are both. Most school districts are hit with that, as well as rapid growth in healthcare costs. And so there are an enormous number of school districts where their foundation aid increase was smaller than their healthcare cost increase this year. And those districts, are subject to the tax cap. And while the tax cap is voluntary, based on the recent trends, I can tell you fewer than 15 districts next year are going to try to override the tax cap. Half of them probably will succeed, and that's it. And they'll be very unlikely to succeed if they try to launch new programs. And so the tax cap is an enormous barrier to raising local funds, which means if state aid isn't keeping up, districts have to cut positions or services or offerings to make up for the rising cost of pensions or health.
And is there a move afoot in New York, or does it exist, where districts are sharing the costs of healthcare insurance? I mean, across many districts?
Yes. So there are, they are approved regularly by the legislature because they need approval, but for small insurance consortiums of districts that have small numbers of employees, up to 50 or up to under 100, there are larger insurance consortiums that districts are part of. But on the whole, when we look at what districts spend on healthcare, it goes up far outpacing inflation every year. So I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think it might have been 3 times last year.
So there are a number of districts that you would say where, and I don't know if you have a count on that, where the cost of healthcare has eaten up, if you will, whatever they're getting in additional foundation aid.
I would hazard for most low need, that is higher wealth districts, their healthcare costs are probably, their healthcare increase is probably eaten up by their foundation aid increase. So.
Thank you. Thank you again for your testimony. So this is Vivian Louie again, just for the court reporter. I have a question. It's perhaps not a question you're best positioned to answer, but it is one of the questions that I had going into the briefings, and this is the last of our speaker panel, so I'm going to ask it anyway. And anyway, so it'll go on the record regardless. But I'm curious about what you think are the role of parents in communities, community-based organizations, leaders, actors in that space, what they can do to advance this dialogue.
Yeah. Well, there is a lot of research to show that parent involvement is a huge positive factor in kids' education. And beyond just sort of going to a bake sale, participating in the school, perhaps a good principal would have a parent council, being able to bring issues to the school. Years ago I was doing some research up in the Inwood section here in New York, and I went to the superintendent's office, and it was early in the morning, and the place was full of parents. And most of them had very little kids because they had no place else to go. They had no other real, the social network, the safety network has been basically eroded in the last 20 years. So I think successful schools integrate the parents into the life of the school. They use their skills. They keep the school open after the school hours, so there's programs for parents. If it's a bilingual or a multilingual school, they use the parents and the grandparents to help kids, understand and be able to speak both, at least English and Spanish or whatever the other language is. I think you can deal with student issues that often arise in schools, because many young these people come to school with trauma. So involving their parents and resolving that trauma is very important. I think restorative discipline and including parents that understand it rather than sort of punitive discipline, those things we know make a difference. So yes, I think parents are critical in this particular, you see the thing about high income parents, they just walk into school, they just say whatever they want. But so it's not an issue. It's just the opposite issue for the principal. How do I deal with that? But but often people without a lot of resources, they may have just come to this country, they might not be here, their status might be a little shaky. They're nervous to come to school. They see this as sort of an official thing. And so I think really good principals and leaders in those schools know how to reach out and connect. Children's Aid Society, and I've been to some schools in New York that had Children's Aid Society. That was great. I mean, they went to young women before they had their babies and began to deal with their issues of health and how they were going to admit to the school. They couldn't afford to have it there every day, but at least a couple days a week they had a doctor or a nurse on staff. They kept the school open after hours so people could come and learn things, but maybe also just play a little basketball. But it was part of the community. So the answer to that is absolutely.
I would actually just add, beyond just the family parent, community involvement. I think one of the hidden or underestimated consequences of the tax cap is it's changed school budget voting, right? So we are a state where outside the big 5 fiscally dependent districts, every school district budget is up for community involvement vote, which is a very positive democratic thing. The tax cap has really turned it into a referendum on, did you follow your tax cap, yes or no, right? And so 98 to 99% of districts that follow their tax cap pass, and the ones that don't have something else explaining it generally, something else in the internal dynamics when you look at the cases, and a very, very small number try to override it. And so there's what we're seeing is, I think, a troubling decline in turnout. So for the tax cap, over 1 million voters turned out to vote, and now we're about 500,000. So the community involvement in that form is really declining.
Sorry, just so I understand what you're saying there. You're saying because the tax cap exists, people don't feel motivated to try to, influence the influence? I mean, I'm just...
What I'm hearing from is that there's much less nuance to the debate. It's, are you aligned with your tax cap or not? And if you are, your budget is very likely to pass. And if you're not, it's about 50-50. And very, very few districts will attempt that. And so there are a lot of districts that frankly probably should and know they should, but they don't want to take the risk because there are also enormous consequences of going to a contingent budget. They've made that much, much more stringent and punitive.
So I've written in favor of community schools models and restorative justice techniques, but given the levels of, entrenched, multi-generational, deep, segregated poverty, what do you think the limits are to those kinds of approaches? Like, how do we balance the obvious benefits of what you're proposing with the realities of the limits of those sort of on-the-ground strategies and the need to address these bigger questions of entrenched residential segregation?
Yes, I think you have to have a comprehensive approach. I agree with you. Sort of, siloing programs and so forth might not do any harm, but it doesn't do maybe the kind of good that we're talking about here, because we're talking about a social good that goes beyond, even in some ways, the classroom. So I think you need a comprehensive model. You talked about community schools. That's one. Carr talked a little bit about regional solutions. I think there was a lot of merit there, to be honest with you. I think the work is good, but the idea is really strong. I think that the investment needs to be made at a very deep level in the personnel that are in the buildings. And to be honest, I don't know if it's really entirely part of the foundation formula, but we're in a country that could actually rebuild most of our schools and afford it and actually create jobs doing it. I don't think having a beautiful school is the answer, but it's certainly part of feeling good about yourself when you're there. And I think the other piece to this is this larger issue, this disconnect between education and the economy. I'm not really, I'm still kind of a book guy, but I mean, I do teach some of this stuff at Georgetown, but fundamentally, there's a whole set of skills that need to be in place that wouldn't answer all these issues, because some of them are based on residence, they're historical, You can't be naive about it. But if you began that process over time and you stayed with it and you funded it properly and they had a stable teaching force and all the things that you know that are important, it would make a dent. It would bend it toward history. We know that. We know in New Jersey, we had an example here in New Jersey. They made a concerted effort to bring parity to the way they funded the schools. And they had early learning programs. They had all sorts of intensive programs. And their scores, if you want to use scores as a model, that's just one model, did actually go through the ceiling. And the demographics between the students in New Jersey that we're talking about and the students in New York were not all that different. And New Jersey's, I don't know if it's quite as wealthy as New York, but it's a high wealth. At least northern New Jersey is pretty high wealth. And so it can be done. It can be done. Connecticut made a huge effort in this regard. And they kind of backtracked a little bit, but Connecticut made a different regard. There are desegregation plans. The Nebraska plan is fundamentally a desegregation plan. And there are other desegregation plans that make a difference. So I think actually there are more structural ways of approaching this than just putting programs in schools. And that would be the way to go if you really wanted to make a difference. And you had to stick with it for a decade, but you could make it happen.
The one thing I'd add on to that, other than the community schools, the pulling it out and funding it as a separate thing, is for small city school districts, it's very hard to improve their infrastructure relative to all their school districts in the state. So small city school districts have both a constitutional debt limit that's calculated much lower than non-city districts. So they get 5% of their 5-year property value average rather than 10% of the most recent years, which non-city districts do. But when they go to calculate it, non-city districts are allowed to take into account what they're going to get in aid. Right? So if you're a large suburban district and you're going to do a $50 million capital project and you get 50% covered by state aid, your debt limit's that you only put $25 million in. If you're a small city district that gets 90% from the state and you're doing that $50 million project, you still have to calculate it as if it's $50 million. So it makes it much harder for small city districts to do projects because they all have to override their debt limit. And these days, the words override and 60%, they cause associations for voters that are not positive, right? They see override, they see 60% threshold, and they immediately think they're violating something. So that's a small change that would help significantly improve the infrastructure.
Andrew, when you referred to Big Four, are you leaving Yonkers out of?
No, I said
Which
big.
one are you living?
No, I say Big Five.
You said Big Four a couple.
I did. When I said Big Four, I'm leaving New York City out.
Oh, leaving New York.
Sorry.
Got it.
New York City is a separate entity. Sorry. Big Five includes them. That's because the rules that govern New York are different in some cases than the Big Four.
Does anybody have any other questions? Well, thank you very much for coming today. We may be back to you. I don't know what happened to Sean Corcoran. Hopefully he's not stuck on some plane trying to get here. I am now opening the session for a public session. To the extent that there's anyone who wishes to speak publicly, could you please come forward? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, my name is Stephanie. So we've learned a lot like these past 2 days, and we've taken a lot of notes, and we kind of have worked towards developing policies towards equity. But I feel like through the kind of duration of this day, which I was present for, I didn't get to hear anything about something that's a very pressing issue that I feel like is pressing. Overwhelmingly, the makeup of our teachers within our public schools is 80% white and 20% teachers of color. And so 2 out of 20 of teachers are actually Black, and those are one of the lowest served populations in New York City. So though that might not play a role directly in funding equity, do we think that like a kind of commitment towards not only recruitment of teachers of color, but also retention of them is something that is vital towards pushing policies forward? And also just through their kind of accessing higher education for students of color, especially students of color who are on the track to become teachers. Usually they're on average graded 3 times harder than their white counterparts. So do we think that addressing inequities in that field can be able to help form policy?
I will say that Dr. Quesada, yes, who you may have missed, who testified yesterday, spoke to this issue. He's the superintendent of schools in Yonkers, and that's one of his goals, and he did put it in the testimony.
No, yeah, I wasn't able to be here for that. But is there anything he said that was compelling with kind of just having a larger presence of teachers of color, or did it not seem like that big of a factor in inequity in schools?
I think that I don't want to misrepresent what he said, but I believe that he said that it's one of the goals and one of the problems with his budget process and the ceilings on his budget, that he does not have the resources that he wants to ensure that the makeup of his teaching body is more diverse.
Sorry, just to, I think this is proper, but Alexandra, let me know if it's not. I think the purpose of this time is to actually hear directly from the public in terms of what your point of view is and what your thinking is, rather than ask for our point of view, which we're gonna, because we want to learn from you, the public, and then we're going to take into account your point of view before we issue and decide our point of view. So I would actually personally, I love that you brought that up. I do think that's a dimension we haven't fully explored. I personally would love to hear how you're thinking about that, specifically any recommendations you might make to help address those 2 issues.
So for me, I'm a student of the New York City public school. I went to actually a charter school for my K through 5. So what I recognize is that my school like desperately recruited teachers of color, and their kind of reasoning for that was because they believe that having students be able to see people that look like them fill up roles of rather that deviated from like what we usually see in media was something that was very important. I changed school districts. To be able to go to a school in Putnam County, which I was able to see. I never had a teacher of color throughout my 5 years there. So something that I did recognize was that lack of teachers that shared experiences with me kind of led to a lack of resources being shared that I could have found very useful and other students could have found very useful. Within Putnam County, I recognize that we're getting an influx of students who are either English second language or from mixed status, and having teachers that aren't familiar with the process or are very detached from kind of how that is felt by us is something that negatively impacted us because we weren't able to access scholarships or be aware of how to apply, and especially now with DACA being repealed. A lot of students are unaware of the fact that they actually do not qualify anymore and things such as that. So I feel like, for me, from my personal perspective, I feel that having teachers of color does play a substantial role in our quality of education and in our experiences in education. And that's, yeah, in turn.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think well said, Iris. I mean, we are planning to do a lot more before we actually issue a report, but this is going to be the foundation for our issuing of a report. So any comments will go into the record. Thank you very much. Thank you. And with that, unless there's somebody else, we're adjourned. Thank you.
complex statistics and regression analysis. And they kept explaining it like at a normal pace, but it was such like each graph just in my head. Like it was so hard to understand. Yeah, it wasn't that it's hard to understand if I had time to look at it, it couldn't make sense, but when you're just looking at tons of plots really quickly, and it just was clicking.
That's the key thing that happened with econometrics. I found the live stream.